All right, hello and welcome. It's so exciting to see all your faces on the screen. Welcome to the Australian National University Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions course on climate essentials for farmers. Well, actually a workshop, I should say. My name's Rachel England and I'm the Executive Education Manager here at ICEDS. I'm also a PhD student, so don't think that I'm fancy. I'm really not. I'm a PhD student with the ANU Fenner School of Environment and Society, so I live in two different worlds. But I grew up in central West New South Wales and my grandparents had a sheep and cattle farm. So every weekend I went and worked and played on the farm. So I do have a bit of an understanding of what it takes to put your heart and soul into farming on Australian landscapes. All right, I will now hand over to Ellen for some words. Hi, Ellen.
Hi, Rachel. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I just wanted to, thought I'd do a quick introduction of myself and Farmers for Climate Action. And some of you, this is your first interaction with us, and some of you have been are some of our climate leaders. So I'm coming to you from Arabana country. I'm on a cattle and sheep station up near Lake Eyre in northern South Australia. And before I came back on the property, I worked as a mixed animal vet, and then I did a Nuffield scholarship looking at the effects of climate change on livestock production, and it really highlighted to me the importance of good climate policy and making sure that there's a farmer voice in how that policy is shaped, and making sure that everyone's sort of point of view and is considered, and also showed me the really great work that Australian farmers are already doing and ways that they can be leaders in this area as well. So I started working with Farmers for Climate Action a few years ago as their producer and industry advisor. And really love it. So Farmers for Climate Action started in 2016 with a small group of farmers in the Blue Mountains that wanted stronger climate action in Australia. So over the years, it has grown extremely quickly. So we now have just under 8,000 farmers on our database that we interact with. And then of that, we have another 350 that are sort of our core farmers that we work with regularly. So that's our Climate Leaders Network, and they get a weekly newsletter. If you would like to be a part of that and you're feeling really strong and passionate about climate action and climate policy after this, please get in touch with me. They also do, so FCA now does a lot of work with the National Farmers Federation. We go to Canberra, meet with the politicians, and doing a lot of, strategic work at a federal government level, as well as, things like this. So educating farmers and helping to get the content that they need out there to adapt and mitigate, ready for climate change, or, in the face of climate change. So we really think that farmers, are the leaders in this field and need to be recognised in that way and helped and supported through that. Last year, we did about a 5-month scholarship for 20 farmers from across Australia. And as part of that scholarship, they did the Climate Essentials course with ANU, the regular course, which goes over 3 days. And the scholars really loved that aspect of, felt like they got a lot out of it. And as did I myself. And yeah, it's a really great all-round sort of knowledge boost. So working with Rachel and her team, we sort of took what those farmers said were the most valuable talks and, things that they could use straight away, as well as things that sort of helped set the picture for them, and created a condensed version that we're bringing to you today. And we've been really happy and excited with the response, and so glad that we could get so many of you along today. It's really, really exciting to see. And it is a bit of an information overload, especially, if you haven't seen any of these lecturers speak to it before. So yeah, I definitely recommend making sure you organise the Moodle page so you can have a look at the course notes later on. And if you think of some questions, you can put them on the discussion board later on. And those, as Rachel said, I think that'll be open for a week or so. So that's really good. And we will, hopefully be able to record some of the lecturers' sessions as well. I think Rachel mentioned that, but if you want to go back and reread. I'll just give you a little bit of an overview of some of the current work that Farmers for Climate Action is doing, just so you can get a bit of an understanding of the organisation. So we're a charity, so we do, our main sort of focus is on 3 pillars, as I mentioned, the advocacy work, so making sure that farmers are getting strong and correct climate policy. For agriculture, we do education, so things like this, and awareness as well. So recently we've been running some electric vehicle events up and down Victoria and New South Wales, which have been going really well. Over in Tassie, some of our farmers have been, one farmer held a field days on his property, sort of showing other farmers what he's been up to mitigate and adapt. We're quite often at conferences and expos and things like that. So we'll be at the Renewables in Agriculture conference in Dubbo towards the end of June. So if any of you are going to that, please let me know. We'd love for you to come along to our networking event, and you can catch up with some of the other farmers that are maybe even be in the Zoom room today. We're also working on the submission about the nature repair market bill, and we will have a webinar on that on Thursday. So if that will only be an hour long, but it'll give you sort of like a really good overview of the state of play of the nature repair markets and, biodiversity sort of markets and payments and schemes on farms. So, working at the areas and what that should look like. We've also got a survey open. We've already had over 450 of our farmers complete it on the nature repair market. So, and how that should look. So please, if you're a farmer, please head to our website and fill out that survey and help us make sure that that is fit for purpose. We also have regional networks as well. So smaller groups of farmers that are working on different projects within their local communities in Tasmania, Northern New South Wales, and Northern Victoria. So if you want to start up a regional network in your area, or you're in one of those areas and want to join one, then please let me know. And then just one last thing before we head off into to learning. We also run a series called Farmer in Focus, and they are a short set of questions that highlight any interesting or new technologies that you're trialing, or even just something that you've been doing for years, but it works really well on your farm to, mitigate or adapt to climate change. So we would love to hear from, we're always looking for new farmer in focus stories, because they're a really great way to sort of spread the word on what farmers in Australia are doing, what works, what doesn't work, what they need, what small policy instruments you need to then make a huge impact. So those farmer in focuses are really important. So if there's something that you'd like to share that you think might be helpful to another farmer somewhere, please also get in touch and let me know. I'm sure you'll probably think of some other things that you might be wondering, what if FCA covers that area or not. So yeah, feel free to email me or message me in the chat today. And I look forward to getting to know you all. Thank you. I'll pass back to you, Rachel.
Great, thanks, Ellen. That was really interesting and great. So before we get going any further, I'm just astounded. We currently have 114 farmers in the room. That's amazing. This is so exciting for us. It really is. And I want to actually call out the expertise that's currently in the room amongst the participant group, amongst you all. There is so much farming expertise in this room right now. So please, I do encourage you to contribute to the discussions and share your stories and viewpoints as we go throughout this workshop. Another bundle of expertise that we have in the room is Professor Mark Howden, who is the director of the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. Hi, Mark, how are you going?
Good morning, Rachel. I think that's the first time I've been called bundle of expertise, but anyway.
Whoops. Mark is my boss's boss's boss, so I'm trying to make a good impression here. Mark, would you like to give a quick introduction for the Institute before you dive into your presentation at 11:30?
Sure. So the sort of Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions at ANU is a cross-university institute. Our goal is to bring together the research expertise of our 570 plus members across ANU, which is roughly 1/3 of all researchers across ANU, are members of our institute, and get them to connect more effectively with each other and also with the decision makers in government and industry and community. And so part of that includes sort of agriculture and food security, but many other dimensions of climate change which are relevant to the talk that I will give today. And also I should just mention that I've been a supporter of Farmers for Climate Action ever since its inception. So I was actually at that workshop or meeting in the Blue Mountains all those years ago. And it's been a fantastic journey as watching how it's evolved, and also watching the influence, the amazing influence that Farmers for Climate Action has had on the whole national debate about climate change and how it's moved it forward.
So we have here Professor Mark Howden, who is the Director of ICEDS, but also is a Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. He's the chair of the ACT Climate Change Council and also an honorary professor at Melbourne University. And Mark has worked on climate issues, climate science, climate variability, you name it, for over 30 years now, and is a leading international academic in this area. So it's really great to have you. And he's actually a really good presenter and a nice guy all at the same time. You're just like a triple threat, Mark. It's terrible. So anyway, I'll hand over to you now with your great presentation.
Thanks very much, Rachel. And it's great to see everyone online, and hi to all of those people online who I know and appreciate your efforts in relation to climate change. So what I'm going to do today is give a sort of a very quick introduction to the underlying climate science, what's happening to our climate, what might happen to it in the future, and looking at greenhouse gas emissions globally and from agriculture in Australia. So what I'm covering is in the IPCC covers around about 12,500 pages. So what I'm doing is a really very quick skate over an incredibly complex topic. And so the sort of question I'll be asking is epitomized in that top sort of right-hand corner. And essentially it's the question about, is this the future we're heading towards, or is this the future we're actually choosing to head away from? And really important to focus that this is choice that we have ahead of us. Our climate is our choice to make at a global scale. And of course, what I'm going to do is, in a sense, set up the problem side of the equation, and other presenters will look at the solution side of the equation in terms of climate adaptation and the social psychology of change. And my own preference is actually to focus on solutions, but it's actually really important in this context to understand what's going on. And that's what I aim to do, is not just give you an understanding of what's happening, but why it's happening. So the underlying processes that give you then confidence in terms of approaching this on an ongoing basis. So the first thing I'd point out is greenhouse gas emissions. This is a graph from the Global Carbon Project, which shows fossil fuel emissions of carbon dioxide. This is from coal-fired power stations and cement manufacture, that sort of thing, going back to 1990. And you can see that those emissions have gone up tremendously. So gone up from just about 22 billion tonnes up to almost 40 billion tonnes. And when you add in the land use change and other components and the other greenhouse gases, we're up to 52 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. And so we're pumping these greenhouse gases out at a huge rate. And if we look at, for example, the little blips in this, so the sort of minor variations caused by the global financial crisis and also by COVID, you can see that there's temporary reductions in carbon dioxide emissions, but very quickly we bounce back from those temporary reductions and back on track to those trajectories of increase. So it does tell you how strong our addiction is to fossil fuels when you actually look at this graph. And unfortunately, our greenhouse emissions continue to go up, continue to fuel climate change. And just to put this in context, those variations in emissions from COVID, for example, that little variation associated with COVID is actually equal to the total greenhouse gas emissions that we were producing back 100 years ago. So, this just, is a massive industry across the world, which produces greenhouse gas emissions. And what we are doing actually has really long-term implications. So when we produce a ton of carbon dioxide, roughly speaking, a quarter of that ton will get absorbed fairly quickly by the oceans and in the process acidifying the oceans. And roughly another quarter will get absorbed by the terrestrial biosphere, that's the trees and grass and soil. And roughly a half will sit in the atmosphere. So it's a sort of residual half that doesn't get absorbed by anything. And that half will actually hang around in the atmosphere for hundreds to thousands of years. And so when we actually think about that, that means that the residual half of last year's greenhouse gas emissions will add to the residual half of the previous year and the previous year before that, etc. So the only way we can stop accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is by taking this down to net zero. So when you hear politicians and others talking about net zero targets, it's actually based on the science that the only way we can stop carbon dioxide increase in the atmosphere is by taking that down to net zero. And because we've actually been pumping out these greenhouse gases and accumulating them in the atmosphere for that reason, we've now got around 421 parts per million in the atmosphere, whereas pre-industrially we're around about 280 parts per million. And if we look at other greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide, they're all at record levels of emissions, and they're all at record concentrations in the atmosphere. So methane is almost 3 times the pre-industrial concentration of methane in the atmosphere. So we're really mucking around with the global atmosphere in a big way. And we've known for at least almost 200 years now that if we put greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we'll warm the Earth. So it's been known for a long, long time that we are on a trajectory to warm the Earth. That's fairly basic science. It's based on the basic physics. So what happens in terms of a physical process is when the sunshine that we see by, that's the visible light, comes through the atmosphere, it effectively passes through these greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane. But when that sunlight hits the Earth or the oceans, it warms them up. We feel this every day when we go out into a bright sunny day. We get warm very quickly. Our bodies, or the soil surface or the surface of our grass or leaves in trees, then re-radiates back in long wave radiation. So think infrared radiation. And that infrared radiation heads out towards space. But in the process, it gets intercepted by these greenhouse gases. So these greenhouse gases are not transparent to infrared radiation in the same way they're transparent to visible light. So those greenhouse gases absorb some of that outgoing long wave radiation, the infrared radiation, and then they re-radiate that in all directions. And some of that comes back to Earth, where it would otherwise continue on its merry way out to space. And so that radiation that comes back to the Earth warms the surface of the Earth more than it otherwise would do. So the more of these greenhouse gases we have in the atmosphere, the warmer the Earth becomes. It's like putting a doona over the Earth. It keeps some of that heat that otherwise would escape against our body, against the Earth, and it warms us up more than it otherwise would do. And that's what we're observing across the globe. And what this graph shows is 5 different sources of information, or 6 different sources of information about how to measure the temperature of the Earth. And we can see that particularly over recent years, they're all very consistent. They all say that the Earth is warming, and the only way we can explain this warming is through our greenhouse gas emissions that we've had. So when we look at last year, it was the 5th to 6th warmest year on record. This year, we're probably going to track to pretty close to the warmest year on record, and probably next year, because of the emerging El Nino, it'll be the warmest year on record. And we could very well exceed 1.5 degrees in an individual year sometime in the next 5 years. So that's recent analysis by the World Meteorological Organization. Last year, because of the La Nina and the very wet year we had, Australia wasn't particularly warm. So the water from that El Nino and the clouds in the sky, which reflect sunlight before it reaches the Earth, tend to cool the surface of Australia. And so Australia wasn't particularly warm last year. It was the 22nd equal warmest because of that cooling influence of the La Nina. And that's an important variation, which we're seeing in terms of temperature, which we need to think about. And if we look at this graph of global temperatures, we can see that even though there is a very significant long-term increase, we can see that there's still variation around the trend line. So some years are warmer than the trend, others are cooler than the trend. Those warm years are often associated with El Ninos, the cooler ones associated with La Ninas. So El Nino and La Nina have a very significant influence globally in terms of temperatures. So just to illustrate what's happening in terms of our sea surface temperatures, I just picked this up about a week ago off the web when I was preparing this presentation. And we can see that over towards Peru and Bolivia, we can see that red patch there. That's the classic sign of an emerging El Nino, with that tongue of red and orange stretching out across the Pacific towards Hawaii. Classic El Nino signal. I think at this stage, very unlikely to break down, very likely to see a very significant El Nino with all the implications that has for Australia. At the same time, if we look across the northwest of Australia, we can see that emerging blue patch around sort of Broome and up towards Darwin. That unfortunately is also the sign of an emerging positive Indian Ocean dipole event. What this does is it tends to result in rainfall out into the Indian Ocean, less rain coming in and less moisture coming in across the continent, and hence drier conditions. So the combination of an emerging El Nino and an Indian Ocean dipole positive event are quite concerning for the forthcoming year. It's likely we'll be having very much less than normal rainfall. And so that combination of things is really important. Unfortunately, what the climate science tells us is that climate change is already being intensifying El Nino and La Nina events. So both ends of the spectrum, our La Ninas are more intense, as are El Ninos, and it's emphasizing the strength of those Indian Ocean positive events. So resulting in increased variability of rainfall across Australia already. This isn't out into the future, this is what's already happening. And so, unfortunately, we're likely to see, instead of that cooling influence that we've seen over the last couple of years with La Nina, we're likely to see a warming influence of El Nino in this year and next year's signals. So if we look at the temperature across Australia, we can see that the temperature's been going up just as it has globally. So Australia is no different from the rest of the world. And we can see that whilst we've had the very significant influence of La Ninas in the most recent years, the long-term trend is very steeply upwards. And if we look at what that's doing in terms of extreme events, so these are extreme hot conditions. Again, this is also a graph from the Bureau of Meteorology. We can see that going back to 1910 and up towards the present, the area of Australia that's experiencing really hot conditions, what used to be thought of as an extremely hot year in any given place, is going up. And so now, roughly on a trend basis, 2/3 of Australia in any given year is experiencing what used to be thought of as an extremely hot year. So our extremes are becoming much more frequent and much more extensive across Australia. And it won't be long before we see one of those years hitting 100% in Australia on the basis of the trend that we've seen. And it could well be next year that we see that 100% area being breached. And then really important to note, though, that even though our hot extremes are increasing, which I just showed you, also in parts of Australia, our cold extremes are becoming more concerning. And this impacts significantly on agriculture. It's the sort of cropping and side of things, but also on viticulture and horticulture. So we're seeing increased risk of early frosts. So if we actually look at what's happening, in this particular case, this is work from Steven Crimp around Wagga, so to the west of Canberra. What we look at in this case is frost risk. So this, what you see up on the screen, is a frost risk diagram. So on the bottom of this is the screen temperature, the temperature at about 1.8 meters above ground. That's where we measure temperatures. So 2 degrees is a light frost. Once we get down to -2 degrees, it's a sort of a heavy frost. On the vertical axis is the day of year where we're experiencing the last frost. So day 180 is in the middle of the year, and day 300 is, say, at the end of October. So what you see, that little triangle, is an indicator of frost risk in this location, and this is for the 1950s. So in the 1950s, you had some relatively mild frosts going up to the sort of August period. But if we look then at subsequent decades, we can see how this evolves. So that's the 1950s, this is the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and year 2000s. And we can see that not only has the sort of number of frosts increased, but the lateness of the frosts increased. So we're getting more heavy frosts later in the year. And this is why in many parts of Southeast and Southwest Australia, we're seeing increased frost damage because two things are happening. One is the flowering period of crops and of vines and fruit trees is being brought forward because on average we're warmer. So those warm conditions tend to get bud burst and pollination and flowering in crops happening earlier because of the thermal clock that sits inside those plants. But at the same time, our frosts are getting later. So we're actually having that double whammy of earlier flowering, but later frosts increase the frost damage tremendously. So those frost events particularly happen in El Nino years where you've got clear skies, low rainfall, low moisture in the atmosphere. But it's also happening for other reasons, which I'll talk about in a minute, in terms of the changes in circulation patterns we're seeing across Australia. Now, as well as temperature going up, we're also seeing very significant reductions in rainfall across southern Australia, less so in the north. So if we look at southwestern Australia, so around Perth, we're seeing very significant reductions in total rainfall across the year, but particularly in winter. So roughly speaking, in that location, around 20% of rainfall has disappeared because of climate change. So becoming significantly drier. In the southeast, it tends to be not so much a change in the total rainfall, but an increase in summer rainfall, which is largely ineffective rainfall, and a decrease in spring and winter and autumn rainfall, the rainfall which tends to be effective in terms of agriculture. So we're seeing this drying trend right across southern Australia. So the question is, why is this happening? And so the reason why it's happening is very tightly linked to climate change. So what we've seen over the last decades is a really significant change in the high pressure systems that we're experiencing over Australia. So those high pressure systems these days are traveling much further south than they used to. They're much bigger than they used to, and they're much stronger than they used to be. So if you're say looking at the synoptic chart, the pressure system chart over the last couple of days, you'll have noticed a big high pressure system traveling across Australia, roughly at Brisbane latitudes. So that's where they used to track at this time of year, around across the centre of Australia. And that allowed the cold fronts to come through between the high pressure systems, bringing rainfall to southern Australia. But typically these days, what we've seen is a depression of those high pressure systems. So they're moving further south than they used to. So oftentimes in the middle of winter, we will see high pressure systems tracking across the Tasmanian latitudes, so Bass Strait type latitudes, rather than across Brisbane type latitudes. And that's pushing the cold fronts right down into the Southern Ocean. So, you know, southern New Zealand type latitudes, rather than where they used to track. And so we're losing a lot of that cold front rainfall. And what this graph shows is where those changes in pressure have occurred. So this comes again straight from the Bureau of Meteorology, and those yellowy colours are where you're experiencing greater high pressure because of that change in those pressure systems. This is just a graphical representation of the trend in increased high pressure. And you could say, well, that's just a bit of random occurrence. The trouble is that this is happening right across the Southern Hemisphere, and it's happening right across the globe. But if we look at the Southern Hemisphere, that's the graph on the bottom right. So the graph on the top left is the one I just showed you. The one on the bottom right is what happens if you're looking straight down from Antarctica and see Australia up there on the top left, South America on the bottom right, and South Africa on the bottom left. And we can see that that change in high pressure system is hemispherical in its nature. So that's why Chile is having decadal scale droughts, why places that used to be great for agriculture in Chile are now effectively semi-arid. That's why Cape Town almost ran out of water in South Africa just a couple of years ago because of these changes in the pressure systems. And in Northern Hemisphere, that's why California is really dry and why the Mediterranean in North Africa is incredibly dry as well. Rivers that in the whole history, you know, going back thousands of years, have never run dry are now running dry because of climate change. So this is the scale of impact that's having already. Now, just to give you a feel for what this might mean in terms of the operating environment for agriculture in Southern Australia, a couple of years ago, I put together this sort of simple set of graphs, which try to map out how your operating environment has changed in the last decades due to climate change. So what I've done here is a really simple thing. For each year, so each dot is a different year. So for each year, I've mapped the temperature against the rainfall in Southern Australia for that year. So each dot is just a different year. And these are the years pre-1950s. And so across those different years, I've fitted a regression line. That's a line of best fit. So it's a statistical regression. And I've put a hand-drawn ellipse around that to indicate the envelope of variation between temperature and rainfall you're experiencing in Southern Australia. And you can see that there's a really strong relationship there with those years which are wetter are also colder, and those years which are drier are also hotter. And that relates to those processes that I talked about before associated with the La Nina. In wet years, we have a lot more cloud around Southern Australia. That cloud intercepts the radiation before it ever gets to the surface, before it warms the earth. And so we're colder because of that reason. And also because we've got a lot of moisture on our landscape. When that moisture evaporates, it cools things down, just like sweat on our body. When it evaporates, cools us down. And so those years which tend to be wetter generate stronger cool influences and vice versa. Now, if we actually split that record, that top left is the same graph that I just showed you, the pre-1950s. The top right is the years 1951 to 2000, and the bottom is those years post-2000. And so you can see that for each of those, exactly the same processes operate because the slope of those regression lines is identical across those different periods. So the same physics is operating in each of those different periods. But when we overlay those different periods one on top of each other, you see the influence of climate change. And you can see that the envelope which you were operating in agriculture pre-1950s now has almost no overlap with the operating envelope post-2000. So we can see that we're almost now in uncharted territory compared with where agriculture used to be operating. So given that we're in uncharted territory, we have to start to be operating differently than we did previously. And we need to be thinking that past experience is less and less relevant to the management decisions you need to make today. And if we look at what might happen in the future, I've overlaid 2 ellipses for potential future climate change for 2030 and 2050. We can see that we're moving further and further out into that uncharted territory that we're starting to experience. And if we look at what's going on at the global scale, a lot of this is associated with what we call the water cycle. So water which evaporates from our land surfaces and our oceans, absorbs a lot of energy in the process. It goes up into the atmosphere and then falls as rain. And in the process, it releases that energy that it was used to evaporate. And that's what we call the global water cycle. So that's moves water around our atmosphere, it moves water around our, from the ocean across the land, etc. And this global water cycle is actually accelerating right now at about twice the rate that's indicated by our global climate models. So our global climate models that everyone tends to rely on for projections of climate change are grossly underestimating the rate of change of our water cycle, which is so critical to agriculture here in Australia, a water limited continent, but also other places on Earth. And because there's more moisture going up into the atmosphere and also more moisture coming down out of the atmosphere, that's increasing our drought risk and our flood risk. So when you strip water off the land surface, you're pushing us towards drought. When we dump that water from those clouds onto our land surface, we're increasing flood risk. So that's increasing moisture variability across our landscapes, and that's generating increased variability in cropping. So whether you look at Australia or the US or other places, we're seeing increased variability in our agricultural productivity because of climate change influences. And if we think about the atmosphere as a big bucket, which can hold water, when we fill that bucket, that's sort of amount of rainfall we get. Now, because climate change has already been warming up the atmosphere, the size of that bucket is actually growing bigger and bigger. So it actually increases exponentially as the temperature goes up. So as a result of climate change, we're already seeing rainfall intensity increase because the size of that bucket when it dumps on us is now much bigger than it used to be because of climate change. And if we look at recent studies in the Sydney Basin using rain radars, it's actually indicating that sub-hourly rainfall intensity has already increased by about 40% due to climate change, even though the models actually would indicate that it should actually have increased by about 6 to 7% because of the average temperature increase. So we're seeing changes happening much, much faster than a lot of our models would indicate. And at the same time, we're seeing increased dryness of the air, what we call a vapor pressure deficit. And that's because as the air warms up, it can hold exponentially more moisture, as I just mentioned, but the supply of that moisture into the atmosphere isn't necessarily keeping up with that increased ability to hold moisture. So the difference between what the air can hold versus what it does hold is actually increasing. And that dryness of the air increasing, when it increases, it tends to make cropping systems less water efficient and grazing systems. So it makes plants use more water per unit growth. And also what we're already seeing in Southwest and Southeastern Australia is observed reductions in river flow. So runoff into rivers and the amount of water in our rivers and dams. And unfortunately, what we're seeing already is more akin to the expectations for 2050 or 2080 climate change scenarios than they are for what any of the models indicate should be happening now. So as one example of this, if we look at what's happening to the Perth Dam inflows, so this is a very well measured system, we see that the inflows into those dams, say going back 100 years, was roughly about 400 gigalitres. These days, we're lucky to crack 40. So because of climate change, changing those pressure systems that I talked about before, there's so much less water going onto those landscapes in the Southwest that those dams, which were designed to hold rainwater, in some cases are now being repurposed to hold desalination water. So the function of those dams has changed because of climate change. We can see that this is a massive, massive drop in terms of the water availability, and that's happening across the southeast as well. So the Murray system has already lost about 40% of its flows due to climate change on average. And those changes in both temperature and rainfall and river flows are impacting on agriculture right across the globe right now. So this is some work done by Ariel Ortiz-Babeo, and what he did was he took agricultural statistics and stripped out the improvements due to improved technology and management, and then looked at the residual impacts of climate change. And when he did this, it really surprised him. I was actually talking to him just last night about this. And he was actually shocked by the results, because what it showed was climate change had already been dragging back agricultural productivity almost right across the globe, with the exception of Alaska and Canada and parts of the old USSR, really cold places. But right across the globe, including Australia, agriculture was being dragged backwards by climate change to a large extent. So in Australia, we've lost about 22% of our productivity, which is pretty much smack bang on the global average. And that number is supported by separate and independent analysis by ABARES in Canberra, so the Department of Agriculture. But we can look at this graph and see that Australia is by far not the worst affected. If we look at those equatorial and subtropical systems right across the globe, so in Central America, across Africa, across Southeast Asia, in some places, yields and productivity are down around about 30% or more compared with what they would be otherwise in the absence of climate change. So climate change is impacting on agriculture really, really significantly right now. We don't have to look at 2050 scenarios or anything like that. It's impacting big time right now. And it's also impacting on fire risk. If we look at what's happening in fire in Australia, we see big changes that's mapped to the right, and we see big changes in fire area, fire danger days, fire intensity. All those metrics of fire are getting worse and worse. So from the next part of the talk, I'll talk about our future. So how things might change in the future. And as I mentioned right at the start, the future, our climate future is ours to choose at a global scale. So at the moment, we're probably now off the really high emissions trajectories. We're probably onto the intermediate emissions trajectories. We're not yet on the low or very low emission trajectories, which are consistent with the Paris Agreement goals, which are keep temperatures down between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So at least we're not on the trajectory which takes us to 5 degrees. 5 degrees, to put in context, is the same sort of temperature change that we observe between our historical temperatures and the last ice age. So 5 degrees gave us ice ages, kilometers of ice across North America and Europe, and our sea levels were 120 meters below where they have been historically. So that's what 5 degrees does to the globe. It changes the face of the globe. So when we're dealing with, say, where we're heading, which is 3 degrees above the pre-industrial levels, that's like 2/3 of an ice age's worth of temperature change. So even 3 degrees doesn't sound like much, but it's actually still really, really big in terms of the Earth system. Now, if we look at those trajectories, which are consistent with our Paris Agreement goals, that means we have to go net zero by around 2050 or less to keep it to 1.5 degrees, or 2070 or 2060 to keep it to 2 degrees. And then we have to take it down below zero. And that below zero, what we call negative emissions, is a real great opportunity for agriculture in Australia, not just to offset emissions, but to actually do more than that, to actually go below zero rather than to net zero. Now, if we look at what climate change might bring in terms of temperature changes, etc., big changes right across the globe. So if we look at this graphs of temperature and rainfall change under a 4 degree scenario, we see, if we look at the top left in terms of temperature, massive changes in heat stress for livestock, for crops, for people. We see potential for changes in growth patterns, because changes in temperature will drive different growth patterns. So shortened growing periods if we don't change our varieties. It'll change water use efficiencies, as I mentioned before, increased dryness of the air, reduced water efficiencies. It'll increase your energy demands in agriculture for things like cooling, if you've got animals under shelter, or pumping of water for irrigation or for cooling of livestock. So changes right across our systems. And to give you a feel for the degree of change, this is work coming out of University of Hawaii. The top left is historical frequency of heat stress days. And you can see it's patchy. Some places have up to about 100 heat stress days a year. If we look at a high emission scenario towards the end of the century, we see big parts of the world, again, equatorial and sub-equatorial places, effectively have every day being a heat stress day. So if you're up in the top end of Australia, effectively every day becomes a heat stress day. And to think about, say, agriculture and other development in Northern Australia without taking this into account makes absolutely no sense to me. If we look at changes in rainfall, we can see further changes in rainfall with very different impacts depending on where you are. So carrying forward those changes we've already seen in South Africa, South America, Western Australia, etc., and also around the Mediterranean, those reductions in rainfall we're already seeing are likely to get carried through into the future and amplified compared with what we've already seen. We're likely to see increased variability of production of agriculture and often around the mid-latitudes, lower average production because of less water availability. We're likely to see increased drought and fire risk and increased flood and erosion risk as that rainfall intensity change, which we've already seen, gets carried through and made more strong than it currently is. If we look at future water resources, those trends which we're already seeing across the Southern Australia and the Northeast are likely to continue. So this is a graph from the IPCC showing percentage change per degree of global warming. And say if we look at the Murray, that's around 19% per degree. So if we go to a 3 degrees scenario where we're currently heading, you multiply that 19 by 3. So effectively it's a 60% reduction in water availability runoff in the Murray area and say in Victoria. It's much worse even over in southwest of WA. And you might think that's really extreme, but as I mentioned before, we've already lost around 40% of our flows in the Murray, and we've lost about 85% of flows in southwest WA. So if anything, this is underestimating the risks rather than overestimating. But you can see that this map, I think, flags really significant increase in water competition across Southern Australia. If we look at drought, this is a recent study, looks at drought across different areas. Some places get less drought, some places get more, and unfortunately, Southern Australia is one of those places that's likely to get more drought. So unfortunately, that's what we're likely to have to deal with. And of course, that's going to have big implications for food trade, because trade is one way of managing climate variability. So we're going to have to be shifting food around the globe more often and more to a larger scale than we have in the past. And it really emphasizes the need to adapt. So there's going to be increasingly a competitive advantage, not to those people who adapt. Really important to focus in many situations. It's not what happens to you, but it's how you respond that's really important. And subsequent speakers in this course will talk about that. Fire risk is likely to increase across the board, particularly in the southeast of Australia. What this is a study which looked at changes in fire. The long term is modelled numbers, so you can see that sort of grey signs of variations in terms of fire weather index and fire season length. The dark line is the average across those modelled numbers going back from 1850 out to 2100, and the red is what's actually happening. And the solid red bar is the trend over the last 20 years or so, and the solid black bar is the trend associated with the models. And in each case, with the fire weather index or the season length, you can see that the reality, the red line, is going up much, much faster than the modelled numbers, the black line. And so things are changing much, much faster than our models would indicate. And that's going to be exaggerated or emphasized by the changes we're likely to see in El Nino, with that becoming faster and sharper than we previously anticipated. And the last thing I want to focus on in this section of the talk, because there's one more thing I want to cover, Rachel, sorry, is that these things happen as packages. They happen as packages of extreme events. So when we have high temperatures, it's likely to be in a period where we have low rainfall and high fires. So those things come as packages. When we have La Nina type situation, we're likely to have increased flood events. We're likely to have increased cyclones impacting on the coast of Australia, the northwest and northeast coasts. So these things come as packages, multiple hazards. And importantly, these multiple hazards are increasing already and likely to increase really significantly, causing really significant intergenerational inequities. And I've seen some of the comments from people in this course saying you're really concerned about these intergenerational factors. And unfortunately, a recent study showed that kids who are born today are likely to suffer 3 times more climate extremes than their grandparents did in their lifetime. So something that happened once or twice a lifetime for their grandparents will happen almost semi-regularly, once a decade for kids who are born now. So really big change in the lived experience of people. Now, the last part of the talk I want to give, and noting that I'm actually just slightly over time, Rachel, sorry about this, is just on greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. So this graph, just drawn straight from the Department of Environment, shows agricultural emissions. So these are direct emissions from agriculture, roughly speaking, 1/6 of our greenhouse gas emissions nationally. But when you add in the transport component and the industrial component, say for fertilizer manufacturers and processing, that 1/6 goes up to around about 1/4. So at a global scale, roughly 29% of greenhouse gas emissions are associated with our food system. In Australia, it's probably slightly less than that because we're very fossil fuel intensive. But you can see that agriculture is a non-trivial player in terms of greenhouse emissions globally. So how can we reduce that in sensible ways? So the first cab off the rank should be looking at efficiencies. So if we look at this particular curve, so this curve, which Penny Ranger and I put together back last century, shows the relationship between live weight gain, so in a sense performance on the bottom, against the emissions intensity, the grams of methane per kilogram of live weight gain on the y-axis, on the vertical axis. And you can see that there's a strong curvilinear relationship there. So those animals which are high performing, high live weight gain, have much lower greenhouse gas emissions per unit live weight gain. So what we need to do in one instance is move further and further down that efficiency curve. So many Australian farmers are already well down that efficiency curve, but that's one way of actually changing the greenhouse gas impacts from agriculture. We can also use additives. So we hear more and more about additives such as Bovaer or 3-NOP, people might know it as, which can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by something like about 40%, but really only applicable to intensively kept animals, so feedlot and dairy animals. So there's questions about their effectiveness in broadacre agriculture, cost effectiveness, acceptability, and regulatory approval. So a lot has been talked about the red seaweed, Asparagopsis. I'm not a fan for that. I can talk about that in questions if people want to ask me, but it's, I think, a problematic thing for Australian agriculture to be proceeding with. We can use oils and fats, which are well known to reduce methane emissions from animals. Up to about 1/6 of emissions can be reduced by oils and fats. And in certain circumstances, their cost benefit is positive, but we need to include life cycle analysis to make sure we're doing the right thing. There's ongoing research in terms of an anti-methanogen vaccine that's been going on since last century. I sort of got some money support that for about $5 million going back in the 1990s. It still hasn't delivered on its promises. It's a long-term agenda there. There is breeding going on to have lower methane emission animals. That reduces your methane emissions by a few percentage per generation. again, a long-term thing. We haven't got a long-term to actually deal with here. There's not denitrification inhibitors, which are used regularly in Europe, but not in Australia, partly because our nitrogen applications are much lower here on average than in Europe. So we haven't got as much riding on reducing nitrification in our systems, but that produces nitrous oxide. And of course, Caitlyn, we're talking about carbon sequestration in the subsequent talk, but really important to note that the main game there, I think, is improving ecosystem services in long-term productivity than it is about providing climate change and benefits. We need to be thinking more broadly about our systems, thinking about footprinting of our greenhouse, of agricultural products, so that they actually can inform purchases about what are lower greenhouse gas emission products, so that those people who are performing better actually get rewarded for that performance. This is a graph just to illustrate that point, coming from, dragged it off the web, but what this shows is for different sources of protein, beef, lamb, down to beans and peas, etc., what the greenhouse gas emissions are per 100 grams of protein. And so if we look at the top bar, which is the beef one, what that shows is that there is no single amount of greenhouse gases produced per 100 grams of protein. There's a huge variation of that. It can range from just about 25 kilos per 100 grams up to 105 kilos, depending on your production system. So I think increasingly the pressure will be to move down that curve, move from the right, where we've got very high greenhouse gas emissions per unit product, down to the very low greenhouse gas emissions per unit product. And we can see that if we don't do that, people will start to make alternative choices. They will move towards pork, chicken, beans and tofu, etc., to reduce their greenhouse gas footprint, because a lot of people are starting to be concerned about their food intake and greenhouse emissions. We can also reduce loss and waste across our food systems. We can have more informed dietary choices, healthier diets. We can focus on social license, and Bec Colvin will talk about this. We can think about new products for markets of plant-based meat, which still require agricultural product to actually produce. It just is moving away from livestock to cropping systems as the source of agricultural inputs. And we can think about new markets, thinking about carbon, biodiversity, water, to supplement, or energy, to supplement agricultural productivity on any given hectare of land. So there's lots and lots of things to think about in ways to reduce greenhouse gas footprint on a per unit product basis or a per hectare basis. We've only just started those conversations, but sitting in amongst them are many, many opportunities for the farming systems to play very positive roles in terms of climate change and to be ahead of the game rather than on the back foot. So I'll just leave that there, and apologies for going over.
But now we have Caitlyn Baljak, who will be talking about carbon in farming landscapes. And Caitlyn sits in the office next to me. She's the emissions removal manager here in the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, but also the ANU Below Zero program, which she can tell you a little bit more about in a moment. And Caitlyn's a country girl as well. It's Bungendore, isn't it, Caitlyn? You grew up in?
I grew up in Collector.
Collector, my apologies. Collector. So I will hand over to you now, Caitlyn, and let you present.
Super. Thanks so much, Rachel. And thanks everyone for having me. As Rachel's mentioned, I'm just down the corridor from her. So I'm joining from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country today. I'd just like to pay my respects to Ngunnawal and Ngambri elders, and pay my respects to elders from whose country you are joining me from, as we have folks from all around Australia dialing in today.
So Caitlyn, we can just see your presenter's view though, not the presentation. Do you want to switch views?
Let's switch the screen.
Yeah.
So that, thanks for that, Rach. It's just because I've got the dual screen set up.
Yeah.
Here we go. That should be a bit better.
That looks good.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rachel. So I'll be talking a little bit about carbon in farming landscapes today. So touching on the Australian carbon market, as well as sort of carbon that is already in landscapes, but outside of market mechanisms. This is a sort of quick overview of my presentation. I'll get us on the same page about some terminology that's thrown around in this space. Talk about the global context of things like carbon removal and greenhouse gas removal. Look at how it applies to Australia, and particularly farming contexts in Australia, some of the co-benefits and co-risks of carbon farming, and talk about some of the controversies that many of you might have heard about as carbon removal, carbon farming and carbon markets have been popping their heads up in the headlines quite a bit recently, particularly in Australia, and unfortunately, not always for the best reasons. So before I go through my presentation today, I just want to get us on the same page about terminology. The carbon removal space can be quite confusing, often because folks are using different terms that either mean the same or very slightly different things. So I'll just wrap our heads around a few terms that describe similar things. When we're talking about taking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere and storing them for a long time, we're talking about carbon dioxide removal, negative emissions, carbon sequestration, greenhouse gas removal. Greenhouse gas removal applies to greenhouse gases other than carbon dioxide technically, but mostly we're looking at carbon dioxide removal when we're talking about removing and storing those gases. When we're talking about greenhouse gases, taking them out of the atmosphere and greenhouse gas reduction, we're talking about carbon farming. So originally this term sort of popped up just talking about taking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, but that terminology has changed a bit over time, and I'll explain why a little bit later in the presentation. We also talk about mitigation and abatement when we talk about greenhouse gas reduction as well. A tradable unit that represents 1 tonne of carbon dioxide is a carbon credit or a carbon offset, and that is something that can be traded in a market system through things like carbon removal and emissions reduction actions. In Australia, we call these carbon units Australian carbon credits, and they make up approximately 3.7% of carbon credits that are traded globally. Some other popular international carbon credits or offsets that are used are Gold Standard and Vera. And they make up a significant portion of internationally traded carbon credits. So this is sort of just a good little dictionary on the carbon removal space and some of the terms that you might see thrown around in this space. So I'll take us back to one of Mark's really great slides, and full credit to Mark for this one. I think it really demonstrates the imperative for carbon removal when it comes to climate change action. This first box represents emissions reduction. That's basically the majority of the legwork that's going to get us to net zero, hopefully. But the part that's going to keep us in line with Paris agreements, so that sort of 1.5 and 2 degree threshold, is actually carbon removal. We have to go below zero in order to achieve that. That is not carbon removal that is offsetting other emissions. That is carbon removal that is over and above emissions that we emit into the atmosphere. So this is sort of the global imperative for carbon removal activities, and to make sure that there are more of them that are just than those that are just offsetting carbon emissions. So to understand carbon removal, we have to take sort of a throwback into year 7 science and look at the carbon cycle. Carbon removal is essentially exploiting mostly natural systems and either speeding them up or upscaling them so that they can remove greater amounts of carbon or do it quicker. So we're looking at exploiting these processes like photosynthesis, so revegetation and soil carbon, to be able to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And we're looking at moving away from these processes that release emissions into the atmosphere, things like methane emissions from livestock and fossil fuels from energy emissions. So carbon farming in the Australian context actually encompasses both the emissions reduction and emissions removal component. And this sort of goes back to particularly a piece of legislation that essentially governs carbon farming and carbon markets in Australia. It is called the Carbon Farming Initiative Act. And even though carbon farming internationally is seen as just looking at removal practices, so these sort of revegetation, soil carbon, blue carbon, in the Australian context, it also includes reductions in emissions, such as different livestock management practices, fire management practices, and waste management, like animal effluent management. So we'll be talking about both sort of reduction and removal practices, and I'll try to distinguish when I'm just talking about carbon removal in this context. So this question, are there any carbon farmers in this workshop? I absolutely know that there are after having a read through the vibrant forum this morning. I would just like for you to share, if you feel comfortable with your colleagues in this presentation, what relationship you have to the carbon market or any experiences that you would like to share. Because I think something that really helps to demystify the carbon market is knowing that there are other folks like yourselves who are out there doing it and talking about some of the challenges that you're facing in this space. So it would be good for you to be able to share what they are in the discussion forum with your colleagues at the moment. Some examples of carbon farming activities that are available in Australia under the Australian Carbon Farming Initiative include emissions reduction activities or avoidance activities, as they're sometimes called, and carbon removal activities. So one of the activities that makes up a majority of carbon removal and carbon crediting practices in Australia is human-induced regeneration, which is essentially a method by which you either exclude livestock from an area of your property or remove feral animals from that property in order to allow the rootstock to regenerate from instead of being grazed down. A few of other common methods are savanna birding that often happens in sort of the Northern Territory and Northern Queensland, which looks at an emissions avoidance tactic, where basically we predict what large wildfires might have happened in the absence of burning and instead use smaller controlled cool fires, and basically taking the difference between the predicted large fire and the actual small fire and crediting the difference between those two methods. And that's particularly important because Australia is a country that is designed to burn. Traditional owners have been burning Australia for tens of thousands of years. And when that practice has been taken away since colonisation, we see that we get much larger, much hotter, more damaging, more emissions intensive fires that burn. And so bringing that practice back into country is something that can both support traditional owners, but can also have really great climate impacts. Something that is really exciting in development in the Australian carbon market is something known as the integrated farm method. We're hoping that it will come online in 2023. We've been waiting for a few years now, but had a change of government as well as an investigation into the carbon market that slowed it down. And this method will essentially allow for you to use several of these methods within a certain area, whereas at the moment you basically have to stick to one method within a project area. Unfortunately, we are not able to do vertical stacking of methods. This is where you have lots of different methods in the same space, even though we understand and sort of bring up Mark's point about the ecosystem perspective that realistically carbon works in an ecosystem. You, in real life, do not separate the above ground vegetation from the below ground vegetation when you're looking at the carbon in the system. However, the carbon market currently does this. So a quick quiz for the audience. I would like you to just put in the chat so that we can have a bit of a look to see what folks might think of what practices currently happen in the Australian carbon market. And that is, what percentage of the roughly 1,500 registered Australian carbon credit projects actively involve planting trees? I'll just give you a few seconds to input your answers into the chat. Is it 2%, 16%, or 34%? It's actually only 2% of projects that are currently registered and the volume of credits that they generate that involve actively planting trees. I think this is a concept that people often get confused about what carbon farming involves and what is producing carbon credits, as when we talk about planting trees, that is the first thing that comes to mind. But what we actually see is that a lot of other methods, and in fact, reforestation is one of the minority methods that is currently being used. This is largely a function of land value at the moment. Embedded in the legislation of the Carbon Farming Initiative is the pursuit of least cost abatement. And this basically means how cheaply can a landholder provide carbon abatement, so carbon removal or emissions reduction, primarily to the Australian government. And so we see that carbon farming is mostly happening on marginal lands with low land value, which is sort of demonstrated in this map here, primarily through human-induced regeneration, mostly through those green projects, and then savanna burning in Northern Australia. But this seems a bit counterintuitive, because when we look at the areas where we could increase things like soil carbon and vegetation, we would ideally like them to happen in areas of higher rainfall. So this map on the right-hand side of the screen just looks at Australian average rainfall versus Australian soil organic carbon. And we see that when you compare these maps, that there is a very, very high correlation between average rainfall and average carbon storage. And so we see that when we do land management changes, we're realistically limited by things like rainfall. And the areas with higher rainfall are areas where we would like to further encourage carbon projects and those beneficial land changes to increase carbon, but we're not seeing that due to the very low price of carbon at the moment. So I'll just give you a quick whip around how participating in the Australian carbon market works as a landholder. Going to the Clean Energy Regulator, which is the Australian government regulator of the carbon market, their website has a list of the methods that are available to you. Unfortunately, they're quite technical, so sort of some of their summary pages I find to be quite useful. And engaging with tools like CSIRO's Look-See and the National Stewardship Trading Platform, which are basically mapping tools that allow you to estimate the potential carbon that you could receive from a carbon project. Now, I would use these with caution, as they are based on sort of satellite data and averages of sort of models that potentially could use a bit of tweaking for particular areas, as these models are based where some data is much more available for some areas, like the East Coast. As you sort of get further west, the data points that feed into these models are a little patchier. So they should be used as an estimation tool rather than properly forecasting the credits that you might receive from these projects, but can be good to sort of understand what you might generate. You are then required to receive consent from other organisations or persons that might have an interest in the land. So for instance, if you have a Crown lease, you will need to get permission from the Commonwealth essentially to pursue a project. Or if there is any native title interest in your property, you will have to receive permission from the prescribed body corporate or the land council who manages that is responsible for that native title area. You can either approach a project developer or go it alone to actually do the development of a project. Now, the sort of pros and cons of this is that a developer can be quite expensive. Most developers, instead of taking an upfront fee for their services, will take a cut of your credits down the track. And this can be anywhere from sort of 10 to 30% of the carbon credits that you generate. So even if the upfront cost is not necessarily there, the sort of long-term payment to these developers can be quite expensive. However, doing it yourself, particularly for a large area with certain methods, can require a lot of paperwork, a lot of reading, a lot of time, because the Clean Energy Regulator does have quite stringent reporting requirements. The next step, once you've decided whether you're going to go with a developer or go it alone, is to apply to the Clean Energy Regulator. They have a portal by which you can do this, establish a contract for the project, and this will outline all your reporting and auditing requirements to demonstrate that the carbon that you are generating is additional. Finally, once you have started to produce ACCUs, Australian Carbon Credit Units, you actually require someone with a financial license to be able to help to buy, sell and trade these on a carbon market, because they are a financial product. And it's important to think about who will be purchasing these credits, because it's all well and good to say that you're helping the climate, I guess, and then to sell them to Santos or BP to help them offset their coal and gas emissions, which obviously is not something we want to encourage. We want to encourage them to reduce their emissions before offsetting them. So when we look at the Australian carbon market and who is buying ACCUs, we see that the Australian government buys about 90% of ACCUs that are traded on the market. So they're the primary buyer. And in the secondary market, we have compliance buying, which is essentially facilities that emit large amounts of carbon dioxide are required to purchase offsets, or preferably reduce their emissions to meet their mandatory targets. State and territory governments are also looking to buy ACCUs to meet their state and territory level targets. And there is also the voluntary market, which is mostly driven by businesses who set voluntary net zero targets. So for instance, ANU has a net zero target for 2025. So for the period 2025 to 2029, we will be looking to purchase high quality carbon credits such as ACCUs. And from then onwards, we're looking to develop our own projects. So to develop our own carbon credits connected with ANU land, research, teaching, or partnerships. This is a bit of a chart demonstrating carbon pricing in recent history. This chart shows that carbon pricing is incredibly volatile. It can be changed very quickly, depending, I guess, at the minister's whims or dirty laundry that has been aired by certain folks who have delivered criticism of the carbon market. I updated this just last night with today's carbon prices. It's actually dropped a little bit from where this graph was screenshot, and the spot price is about $34 today. So the spot price is the price that the Australian government and the compliance market will be paying for carbon credits. Co-benefits are becoming a way in which to encourage carbon farming by adding additional value both to the buyer who are looking for co-benefit premiums for things like enhancing biodiversity, supporting First Nations caring for country, but also co-benefits to farms, things like water retention that can be increased by increasing soil carbon, things like erosion control, which can be increased through increasing the vegetation cover on your property and the roots from that vegetation holding soils together. So this is changing that dynamic. When I was talking about how where carbon farming is happening is mostly a function of land prices, and hoping to see that through bumping up the carbon price and the carbon value and delivering other benefits, we can ensure that carbon markets are able to reach more folks around the country. So at the moment, there is sort of no standard price for co-benefits. A few state governments and the federal government are trying to develop schemes to basically evaluate and price biodiversity co-benefits as an example, and voluntary offsetters. So companies who have voluntary net zero targets are also sort of setting their own prices for how much they are willing to pay for co-benefits. And I've hyperlinked these in the presentation so that you can go and investigate if you're interested in what some of those schemes and some of those co-benefits look like. An example of a co-benefit that a buyer might not pay for, but has a level of value to a property owner, is shelter belts. There are lots of these kinds of co-benefits that might actually deliver more value to your farm than the cost or the price of the carbon. And shelter belts, for instance, not only do they protect stock under current conditions, but they can act as a really great climate adaptation mechanism. From Mark's presentation, looking at that increase in those extreme temperatures, the shade provided from shelter belts will be great for stock and also minimise things like erosion when we see that with those hot prevailing temperatures, some areas are also experiencing increases in wind, drying out your soil more, and that vegetation cover can prevent that soil from drying out. So when we talk about co-benefits, we also have to look at the co-risks of carbon farming. There are a few different kinds. Some of the economic and legislative risk is that, particularly for sequestration methods, you are committing to a 25 to 100-year contract period for which you must ensure that the carbon stays on your property and does not return to the atmosphere through a loss event such as bushfire. So this can limit the decision-making that is available to you, but also to your children when it comes to what can be done with your property. As demonstrated by the graph about pricing, the significant price and market uncertainty, you are in a sort of legal obligation and with a risk of having to pay back credits if you don't meet the strict obligations of the Clean Energy Regulator, and changes in the rules, because it is such an immature market, can be applied retroactively. So you have to change to the rules of the game when you don't know what the rules are that you're going to be playing by necessarily. Socially, as I mentioned, it can sort of restrict the decisions that are available to you and your children. And in some areas, carbon farming is starting to be seen as sort of locking up land, and that people are being bad neighbours if they're not encouraging people to come and work with stock instead of planting trees and sort of leaving that land in their eyes unattended. We see that when it comes to, I guess, family farms developing carbon projects, this is definitely not the case. But as particularly resource companies are starting to buy up land in rural areas and put them aside for carbon crediting projects, we're seeing this emerge more and more in rural communities. There's also environmental risks. Vegetation projects in particular increase water demand, and climate change, even though carbon projects are trying to stop climate change, will still be impacted by climate change that is already in train and climate change that we are expecting in the near future, such as that pointed out by Mark in his presentation. So a really good example of this is soil carbon. This is some work out of Department of Primary Industries in New South Wales. They basically looked at, under different emission scenarios, how soil carbon will change in New South Wales. So regardless of whether you have a carbon project registered or not, you can expect that your soil carbon that is currently in the soil, holding it together, increasing water retention, will become lessened under future climate change. And this is because we're expecting greater heat extremes, longer, more frequent, more severe drought, and less rain when it is needed. And these folks at DPI also found that for vegetation projects, once you've removed the fertilization effect, which is essentially the increased CO2 in the atmosphere that plants enjoy to support photosynthesis, once you removed that effect, that they actually saw a decrease in vegetation. They predicted that vegetation would decrease under future climate change too. So that's speaking to that climate change risk aspect of carbon in our landscapes. There's also a concern for northern fire regimes, so those savanna burning projects that I was talking about, because this is the historical trend for Australia-wide, but particularly focusing on northern Australia. We're expecting that if this trend continues, which sees wetter wet seasons and drier dry seasons, with the increased heat from a warming world, that we will see worse fire conditions. And so that careful, cool burning management may become more and more difficult to do when you're working in a hotter, drier world that has more fuel available from a wetter wet season. So even though they're receiving more rain, which we consider generally when we think about growing plants to be a good thing, it can actually work against you when you're looking to manage things like fire. And this is something that is being talked about globally, not just in the Australian carbon market, but the Californian carbon market has already lost its insurance mechanism for climate change and wildfires. About 90% of that insurance mechanism that is meant to last 100 years has already been burned up just in the past few seasons of wildfires. We haven't seen this in the Australian carbon market because most of the carbon farming projects are in areas where we don't experience bushfire like we did in the Black Summer, but we expect that as those projects move towards the coast, this will become more and more of an issue. And the Australian Carbon Credit Scheme does currently have an insurance mechanism in place, but it may not be enough to account for future climate change. So, as well as sort of international carbon being in the spotlight, this is something that has come up recently that is important to know when looking at entering the Australian carbon market. Back in sort of July 2022, a bit earlier, some ANU researchers came out with some information suggesting that potentially carbon credits were being over-credited for certain kinds of projects. And when you sort of see these rather shocking pictures of what your expectations for a carbon project should be, so project start on the left and project finish on the right is sort of what we would hope would happen once you removed grazing from the area. This is a human-induced regeneration project. Instead, seeing that the changes were not as dramatic and not delivering the amount of abatement that we would like to see from these practices. This then triggered something that was known as the Independent Carbon Credit Review, the CHUB review, which basically investigated the scheme and announced that the scheme was sound, but then proceeded to announce sweeping changes in governance, asking for increased transparency, revoking the avoided deforestation method, and increasing, I've just had the lights turned off in my room, increasing the scheme-wide buffer, so that insurance mechanism for things like risk of reversal, and hopefully that will include for climate risk as well. So there are still these changes that are being implemented following the change of the review, so the market is highly uncertain at the moment. The public reception of the review was somewhat mixed. Some folks came out and said it was fantastic that the scheme was allegedly called sound by the CHUB review, but some folks who were not so convinced that the review had gone deep enough into some of the problems that had been erred previously before the review had been undertaken. And so I guess it sort of leaves with all of this uncertainty in the market. Is there an alternative to participating in carbon markets, but still farming carbon? And we see that you don't have to participate in these schemes to reap the benefits of carbon farming. When we're looking at these practices, and these are practices that most of you are probably already doing on your farms to an extent, things like revegetation, particularly of waterways and through things like shelter belts, increasing soil carbon through cover crops or stubble retention, excluding grazing from sensitive areas and fire management, we see that these practices can actually help you adapt to the impacts of climate change. And I've put down some of those adaptive impacts there. Steve Crimp will give you another presentation a bit later today, explaining some of these adaptive actions in more detail. But carbon farming can be one way that you can adapt to climate change. So to my question earlier of who is a carbon farmer, it isn't necessarily just folks who are participating in formal carbon markets. These are sort of examples of local NRM organisations, some of which you're probably quite familiar with or have worked with before, provide opportunities to access native seed stock, do erosion control, these other great management actions for increasing carbon in our landscapes without having to participate in formal carbon markets, so that you can receive the on-farm benefit, so that co-benefit that I was talking about in what makes up a carbon credit earlier, without having to go through the rigmarole of participating in a market. And those co-benefits such as biodiversity will still occur, which we know help with things like farm productivity. They just aren't marketized or monetized and traded in a formal market. And so you can still deliver those benefits without participating in those schemes. So my recap from this is that participating in carbon markets via carbon farming can deliver new income, deliver co-benefits to both yourself and the broader ecosystem, and they can help with climate action, perhaps in a much smaller way though than has been professed in the media, but tread with caution as there's a lot of uncertainty that still exists in particularly the Australian carbon market. And although carbon farming is a climate change solution, it will still be impacted by climate change. So you will need to adapt in your planning if you are looking to undertake carbon farming. Steve will give you a bit more information as to how you can do that. You don't have to participate in the carbon market to reap the benefits of carbon farming, and it's important to share your knowledge about carbon farming. So from the forum and from the chat, we will have seen there's lots of folks who do have sort of a hand on the pulse when it comes to carbon farming and the carbon market. It's really important to share your experiences with other folks in the ag sector, because this really is a space that needs to be demystified. And Bec Colvin will talk to you a little bit later about why it is important for you to share your experiences as sort of a trusted representative of your community. Super.
So welcome back everyone from the break. We now have Dr. Steven Crimp with us, who will be talking about adaptation options within Australian agriculture. Steve is actually at the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. I'm saying that a lot. I'm going to start just saying ICEDS from now on, as we like to call it. He's also at the ANU Fenner School of Environment and Society, and he's a climate applications scientist, but does quite a lot of work with primary industry in Australia and internationally, quite a lot in the Pacific even. So I will hand it over to you now, Steve, for your presentation. Let you get started.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks for the introduction, and welcome to this second session where I'll be talking about adaptation quite broadly, and talking in some detail about some of the challenges and what do we mean when we talk about adaptation. As a way of providing you with a little bit of outline, you can see there that we'll start by framing this sort of concept of adaptation. We'll look at the challenges that currently exist within the Australian agricultural systems, and you may have heard some of this from Mark already. Then we'll be talking about scales of adaptation and the idea of moving from, say, tactical adaptation, which is fairly small scale, through to transformational change, and you know, how is that different, and how do we actually start to contemplate that? I will touch very briefly on what I'm calling there a new focus for adaptation, and if we do have time, we'll talk a little bit about trying to characterize good adaptation from maladaptation, but that is if time allows. So let's just get straight into it and talk about a framing for adaptation. And one of the documents that we tend to use as a reference document are the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their assessment reports, and the sixth assessment report, which is the most recent report released in 2022, defines climate adaptation as a process of adjustment to actual or expected climates and its effects in order to moderate harm or to take advantage of beneficial opportunities. Now, for many of you that are practicing, have been on farm for many years, you sort of go, well, that's what we do on an annual basis. You know, we look at the seasonal conditions, we look at the markets, and we try to optimize our response in order to maximize those beneficial opportunities and also to minimize those years where things could be harmful or detrimental to profit lines. So the idea of climate adaptation is probably one that you're very familiar with. I do tend to differentiate between what we would say as a managed system versus a natural system. So the idea of adaptation in natural systems is a much more passive type approach, where you are intervening in that system from time to time, but you're trying to sort of build resilience into that system for the long term. The one thing that I do like to be explicit about is the idea that when we talk about adaptation, we're not just talking about technology, adoption of technology at the farm, but we have to think about adaptation as a range of different dimensions. And we have to think about adaptation opportunities across the whole agricultural value chain. And so if we take that whole value chain approach, then what we need to think about are adaptations that are included in terms of structural dimensions, the physical dimensions, the social and the institutional dimensions. So what do I mean by that? Well, as a brief sort of description of those different dimensions, if we think about the structural and the physical dimensions of adaptation, we are really focusing there on the technology. So the engineering, the built environment, the new innovative technologies, and improvements in the ecosystem-based services or building resilience in those services. And that by far is where most focus currently lies in terms of when we think about adaptation. But there are other important dimensions to the adaptation, which is the social adaptation, where we have to think about the education of the communities, but from young through to the older cohort of the population, thinking about capacity building, thinking about information systems and information extension. So how do we actually get information to people to help make decisions or alternative decisions? And then, of course, there is the behavioral changes. So those are the social dimensions of adaptation. And then finally, we have the institutional dimensions of adaptation, where we really need to focus on things like the economic organizations, laws and regulations, government policy and programs. So all three of those dimensions are particularly important and need to be dealt with as a sort of a whole. But at the moment, unfortunately, we do tend to focus more on the structural and the physical elements of adaptation. But yeah, we have to see those as a continuum and think about those as a whole. So for those of you that do like the sort of systems diagram and want to get that sort of systems understanding of adaptation, when we adapt or our practices, we're really responding to a range of different triggers. Those could be the technological triggers, there could be markets, a change in commodity price, change in niche products and the consumers' sort of views of those. The social triggers, again, this could be in response to consumer pressure or consumer needs or people's views of how products should be produced and their provenance and their place within the ecosystem themselves. And of course, we have the environmental triggers. So that would be protracted drought conditions or flood conditions or climate change. But in order to actually have a successful system where adaptation can occur, we need this enabling environment where we have healthy research organizations, we have businesses that are willing to take risks and think about adopting novel approaches. We need to have other supporting organizations, go-between organizations, markets and consumers, and our education system as a whole is the sort of enabling environment where we can start to think about these innovative responses and the process of adopting those responses. And if we've got that right, then we can think about the capacity to innovate and the innovations that come from that. So it really is a system that has complex interactions. There are triggers, there are outcomes, but there is this sort of policy environment or enabling environment that actually can trigger adaptation to a greater or lesser degree. In the Australian agricultural context, we're already seeing adaptation pan out in response to the historical changes that we've seen in climate. And probably one of the easiest ways to see that is in terms of changes in patterns of agriculture. And this map here shows you, compares two periods. So it compares the what we would call the most recent period, 2016 to 2020. So it is a short period of time, but it compares that against, in this case, the density of cropping in those two periods. So 2006 to 2010 compared with 2016 to 2020. So the legend there shows that the sort of yellow to brown color is where there has been a decrease in the density of cropping, and the sort of greens to blues would show where there's an increase in the density of cropping. So we have seen reasonably consistent patterns in part of the country, certainly in WA, in South Australia, and in Victoria, we have seen a general decline in the density of exclusively sort of cropping systems. But in New South Wales and Queensland, that pattern is not as uniform, and there are some areas that have increased and some that have declined. Now, the maps that I'll be showing you, the next series of maps are from a colleague that works at at ABARES, and this is a sort of 2021 report. So you can see the QR code there. So if you've got your cameras handy and you want to sort of aim your phone camera at that QR code, that will actually take you to the link where the paper is actually highlighted. So moving on to look at, so this was just a sort of view of what's happening geographically. It really doesn't get us down to the sort of questions that we may be asking to say, well, okay, this is just a sort of geographical representation. How much of this is driven by markets? How much of this is driven by size of property? How much of this is driven by the age of farmers or access to information? None of that we can actually tell from this process, but it is, I think, a sort of a reasonably robust insight into the fact that we are now, because of climate change, we are now starting to get these geographical and spatial changes in agricultural production in Australia.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. So what are we actually adapting to? The thing that we're adapting to, I suppose, is the changes that Mark would have shown you in the first presentation. So in the southern parts of Australia, we're starting to see a drying trend. The projections would suggest that is going to continue into the future, and temperatures are already starting to show considerable positive trends, so warming occurring. So we can already start to measure the impact of the changes that we've seen historically on farm profitability if we're using some of the same models that ABARES use in their economic analyses. And again, this is drawing on Neil Hughes's paper, but what this shows is the impact that the changes we've seen in recent climate, so this is from 2001 to 2020, this is the impact that climate has already had on farm profitability. So the areas that are sort of light pink in color would suggest loss of profitability of anything from 25 to 50%, all the way through to this very, very strong red colors showing very, very significant losses in profitability. The yellows there would be where profitability is either increased or decreased by an order of around 25%. Because this is a model, and this model is run at a sort of a uniform grid across the whole of Australia, we can look at the different grids and we can see, well, what is the distribution? So rather than look at a map here and look at the region that we live in and say, okay, well, you know, was climate sort of impacting us negatively, or didn't have an effect, or there was a slight positive effect? We can look at the distribution as a whole, which is this diagram at the bottom. So the results from the modeling show that over that historical period from 2001 to 2020, the changes that we've seen in climate have already served to reduce profitability in Australian agriculture by around 22, almost 23%. So you can see that average area there. You can see that about 20% of the grids of the total area that would be practicing agriculture, you can see that the losses there are sort of anything from sort of 5% to about 15%. The average is around 23%, but there is this long tail of considerably negative impacts and loss of productivity, with a bump in the tail right at the bottom end there. So what this suggests then, I suppose, is that Australian agriculture is sensitive to climate change and has already started to present some impacts in the form of loss of profitability. Now, what we can do is look at the future and say, well, let's use the same model and look at some different futures. And I'm pretty sure Mark would have talked to you about the different emission scenarios and the different scenarios associated with change, what we call our representative concentration pathways. And so if we look at the impacts of two different scenarios for the future, so one is what we call our representative concentration pathway 4.5. So that's still a sort of a growth in our emissions, a continued growth in our emissions, and those emissions occur much later in the century than the more progressive ones. And then we have our RCP 8.5, which is our sort of what is currently being called business as usual. So where there's little action at a global scale, and this is what we would call our current sort of trajectory without any significant global action. So if we look at those two different scenarios and we use the AgMIC model that ABARES has, and we use different climate models and produce an average from those different climate models, this is the sort of impacts that we might expect on agricultural productivity going forward. Now, this is these percentage changes here are different from the previous map I showed, which was for the 2001 to 2020 period. So what we're showing here is a sort of a change or a deviation from the baseline, and that baseline period is 1950 to 2000. So this is comparing what happens in the future with what has happened over that long-term average period of 1950 to 2000. So what we can see is that for a future scenario where there still is continued growth in emissions, but there is still considerable regions that are likely to be negatively impacted. And we can see that WA in particular and parts of Queensland would certainly experience losses of profitability of the order of that sort of 25 to 50% mark if this future is realized. And if we follow that sort of 8.5 scenario, you can see that the area of more significant profitability loss is much, much larger. And again, you can look at the distributions at the bottom, which are associated with those maps, looking at the individual grids. And under that most sort of severe scenario, the average loss of profitability across Australia as a whole is almost 32%. And if we follow the sort of more modest growth in emissions, the average is around 13%, but still very long tails on the distribution there. For those of you that don't like maps but prefer tables, this is a sort of a view of the potential percentage changes in profitability for different farming systems. So they've been aggregated into different regions. So the northern beef region, southern beef, there's the sheep region, which is sort of more in the southern parts of Australia, and then there's cropping, northern, southern, and western regions. Now, if you want to get some more clarity on where those regions actually preside, again, you can use your phone, click on the QR code, and that will take you to the publication. But I think that the take-home message here is if we look at the national, so we aggregate everything up to the national scale, the average loss, irrespective of if you're a cropping enterprise or a livestock enterprise or a mixed enterprise, that average for a 4.5 RCP is around almost 5%, and then it's around 26% if we follow that most severe trajectory. So the issue is these are the challenges that we actually have to adapt to. So certainly more challenging environment in which agriculture actually has to occur. So one of the most important things to establish is if you're thinking about adaptation, is the first question you have to ask yourself is, well, how resilient is my current system? And so it's really a stock take of your existing system. And there are a few tools out there that can help you to undertake that sort of stock take. And one of those tools is a tool called Dr SAT, which is a sort of an analysis of your farm system resilience. So if you focus your attention on the top part, you can see the URL for the Dr SAT. Sorry, let me just go back there. So yeah, so there's the URL, and I'd encourage you, if you're interested in doing that sort of baseline activity so that you can start to think about your adaptation trajectory, this is one tool that can help you. Some of you may already sort of be on that journey and have done a sort of really accurate baseline already. But this is a tool that does assist in that process. It provides you the opportunity to look at the resilience of your farm, look at the projections for the future. It allows you to compare your farming system in terms of the resilience to others in a sort of de-identified way. So you can start to see how it's sort of in a relative sense, how resilient your system is compared to others. So I'd encourage everyone who hasn't had a look at this tool to potentially have a look at it as a way of baselining. So when we talk about adaptation, we need to think about adaptation on a range of different scales. And when I talk about these scales, it's the sort of incremental or tactical scale, which is the sort of what I call making small changes to your current system. So the adaptations that you're following are really to keep your current system persisting. It's not to change your current system, but it's to make your current system more efficient or slightly more resilient. So that's usually defined as tactical or incremental adaptation. And it's successful for reasonably modest changes in climate, but we know from the research that's been undertaken that tactical adaptation is only successful for reasonably modest changes in climate conditions. If we do realize the sort of 4.5, sorry, the RCP 8.5, which is the sort of 3 degrees of warming and more, then we need to think about larger scale adaptation. And I talk about this as systemic adaptation. So this was if you were taking lots of different incremental adaptation options and putting those together in a way that modifies your current practice. And then lastly, there is the very large scale adaptation, which is the transformational change. And you know, we've seen examples of transformational change where producers are reducing the area that is in agriculture. They're starting to sort of look at large solar arrays to produce energy. That's one form of transformation. It's not one that I'm advocating for, but I'm just identifying that as an adaptation option. The problem that we face, though, is as we move, most people are comfortable thinking about tactical or the sort of incremental adaptation because it's not as risky or complicated or costly as the other two tiers. So as we move from incremental to systemic to transformational, there is increasing complexity, there's increasing uncertainty, there's increasing cost and increasing risk. And so we tend to, in some instances, be stuck in the sort of lower tier and the middle tier adaptation because of that uncertainty, cost, and risk. And sometimes we see transformational change occur, and you know it can have dire consequences if it's not done effectively. It is somewhat difficult to try and differentiate between what is incremental and what is transformational. And you can see on this on the slide here that there's some examples of different sort of adaptation options. And as I've said, sometimes it really depends on the scale at which those options are being implemented. And the question is, do these options fundamentally change your current farm operations? And if the answer is no, then you are sort of still in that incremental stage. If the answer is yes, and you're achieving this at scale, then you're starting to sort of move up the tiers into the transformational area. The point that I wanted to make is I think that in terms of an adaptation journey, I think it's logical that we start our journey at the incremental or tactical part of the route, so to speak, so that we're comfortable. We're already making, as our farmers are already making incremental and tactical changes depending on the seasonal conditions. So it's not a large leap to start to think about that longer term. But if we think about adaptation as a continuum, we need to think about the systemic and the transformational options as well, because, as I said before, incremental and tactical adaptations will be successful for fairly small or modest changes in climate, but a lot will be much less successful if we start to experience fairly considerable or large changes in climate conditions. Now, my colleague Angus is following me, will be giving a presentation on one of these sort of new adaptation options, which is one of the examples is the sort of idea of agri-voltaics. So actually aggregating energy and agricultural production on the same land use. So rather than taking land out of agricultural production, you're actually integrating the energy production into the agricultural production. So there's no loss of production. But I'll let Angus talk about that. The other sort of the other area that I'd like to talk about very briefly is this idea of the circular agriculture. So this is an idea of looking at waste streams, not just on your farm, but certainly on looking at waste generated from other processes and using that as an input into your own farming systems, or looking at the opportunities there. So not to spend too much time, because I know I've run out of time, but certainly this report by the Farming Institute has some really, really good examples of how circular agriculture is starting to take hold in Australia and is providing resilience to agriculture and opportunities that will be profitable in the future. And these are just some storylines from that report that talk about food waste and looking at sort of the food, feed and fiber production and the circular economies there. So it makes for very, very interesting reading, and I'd encourage you all to do that. I realize that I have run out of time, but the idea is that we need to continually test the changes and the adaptations that we are making, because we have uncertain information. We don't have a clear idea of what the future holds. There is also the risk that we do the wrong thing, and that we start to sort of push the system in a way that is not reduces its resilience. And so we're thinking about that term maladaptation. So what I would encourage you to think about is the adaptations that you may be implementing on farm or as part of your business. There needs to be a continual monitoring and evaluation of those adaptation options, just to ensure that they are taking you down the right path and they're not resulting in maladaptation. So there is a strong monitoring and evaluation component to that. So that's probably enough from me. I do apologize, I am 2 minutes over. I'd just like to thank everyone for their attention. Anyone who wants to ask me a question, I'll have a look at the questions in the chat, and I'll try and address as many of those as I can. But those of you that want to direct questions to me directly, please please feel free to contact me. There's my email address. So thanks everyone for your attention.
a presentation from Angus Dunne on renewable energy in agriculture, and Angus is actually about to finish his Masters of Science Agricultural Innovation at the Fenner School here at ANU, but also is a landscape planner with the Malone Institute. So over to you, Angus. I'll get you to share your screen and you can start.
Beautiful. Thanks, Rachel. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, that's good.
All right, I'll just share the screen. Can you see the presentation slides coming up?
It's coming up. That looks good. I can see it.
Brilliant. So really excited to be here talking with everyone today about renewable energy and building on Steve's presentation around some of the adaptations that are available to the facing climate changes. Seeing everyone's posts on the middle page, I think it's a pretty impressive cohort that we've got here today. So I'd really encourage anyone, if you have any questions, to throw them in the Q&A. But also for those who are further down their renewable journey, if you're comfortable sharing some of the choices you've made and some of the problems you've come up against with your peers, I think that would add a lot of value. But a bit of an overview today, we're going to have a look at some of the energy in Australia and on farm, and then look at what are some of the renewable challenges with energy in Australia. We'll touch on a few of the renewable energy options that are being used on farm and have a look at a few case studies as well. And this is going to be a bit of a broad brushstroke. I recognise we've got quite a diverse group of people here, and we're trying to give some information that's going to be useful for everyone for where they are. The picture you can see on the left-hand side is an example of agri-voltaics, which, as Steve touched upon, is the idea that we can both produce agricultural food and fibre and generate energy under solar panels on the same piece of land. This example comes from Germany, and it's a cropping trial with 4 different varieties under panels, but we'll get into that a little bit later on. So to begin, we're going to have a look at some of the energy use in Australia. This data on the left-hand side comes from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and it's essentially breaking down where energy is used in Australia based on the industry. So we can see for agriculture on the left-hand side here, over a 5-year period, the energy use is pretty consistent at about 125 petajoules on average per year. On the other side, we have household consumption, which is well over 1,000 petajoules. So this is just to give a bit of an idea of where energy use is going in the country. These other boxes here are giving us the breakdown of how energy is generated for most of the East Coast. So the NEM, or the National Electricity Market, is part of Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and Tasmania. So the major generator for energy through the East Coast is black coal. But second up is actually rooftop solar. And just to make the distinction between rooftop solar and solar farms. So solar farm is what we're seeing in our landscapes a lot of the time driving down a highway. The second biggest generator at the moment in the East Australian coast is coming from rooftop solar, which is a really big change for how we've traditionally produced energy. The other states in terms of WA, Northern Territory and ACT are a little bit different. WA is very much gas dominated, while the ACT is renewables. You can see Queensland and New South Wales are black coal, followed by rooftop solar. Victoria is brown coal and wind. South Australia is gas and wind, and Tasmania is predominantly hydro. So I know Mark would have gone through emissions in agriculture a bit, but we're just going to touch on these briefly to understand where the main emissions causes are. So this table on the left-hand side comes from the National Inventory Report. And as of 2018, for Australia's total carbon emissions, about 13.5% are attributed to agriculture. But it's important to realise this number doesn't include our fertiliser and pesticide application. It's also not taking into account fuel use on farm or the emissions produced of transporting goods to and from farm. But from the data we have, it shows that 68% of those emissions are coming from enteric fermentation, which is just the natural digestive process of ruminants and livestock. So that's predominantly methane coming through. The next biggest contributor is our soils. So almost 20% is coming based on our soil management, what's happening on farm. If we take this to a bit of a global view, this pie chart is looking at the world emissions and breaking them down into sector. We can see agriculture, land and forestry, and this bit of a green slice of the pie is close to 20%. But there's also additional emissions for agriculture in terms of energy for processing, and we've got food and tobacco and paper and pulp over here. So this is just to highlight that agriculture and our land management activities actually have a big part of Australia's emissions and global emissions, but also it can be really tricky to find out how much emissions are being produced depending on what calculations they're actually taking into account. So in terms of energy use on Australian farms, this data is coming from ABARES, and it's essentially looking at a 10-year period from 2012 to 2022. So we have broadacre enterprises, beef, cropping, dairy, mixed, sheep and sheep beef. And it's really important here to note as well that these are the averages, and the individual management of these farms is always going to be different. But this is giving us an idea of the average spend over 10 years. The golden bar is giving us electricity, the lighter bronze is fuel, oil and grease, and the beigey white colour is fertiliser. So if we look at a cropping example, on average, they're spending almost 200K per year in fertiliser, close to 100 grand in fuel, oil and grease, but only about $7,000 in electricity. So if we're thinking about some of the adaptation to these climate changes through renewable energy, for a cropping system, you can start to generate your energy needs of about 7 grand on farm. After that, you're going to need to be able to put that energy back into the grid or to be storing it in a battery or another system. The next step would be actually converting some of the on-farm machinery, utes, side-by-sides to take other fuel sources, or even going a step further and starting to produce some of the fertiliser or changing land management strategies to drop down this energy use. For another example, if we think about a dairy where if the dairy installs solar panels, a lot of that energy demand for the dairy is going to be early in the day and then later in the evening when it comes to milking. But those panels are going to be generating a lot of energy through the middle of the day. So the actual supply and demand curve of that energy doesn't match up. So for those panels on farm, that additional energy can either be sold into the grid or it needs to be stored or transferred into another use. And so the dairy would be producing energy, but also needing to buy energy back out of the grid to meet their demand, unless they have a way of flattening out that supply and demand curve. So this figure is just to give a bit of an idea of the existing grid and also where that grid may go to and some of the challenges. So on the left-hand side in the purple, we've got a bit of a breakdown of what the current electricity grid looks like in Australia. So we can think about it as a pretty centralised system where we have a large-scale generation facility and we're distributing that energy over large distances, generally to a user who is only consuming energy. But as we saw in that energy breakdown before, where the national electricity market is essentially starting to generate a lot of energy from rooftop solar, that means the consumers are now becoming generators as well. So to really leverage this capacity, we need to have systems that are a bit more decentralized and allow transmission to go both ways. And this brings up one of the big challenges with renewables, which Steve touched on before, and that's the access to information. So actually finding the information for what systems are right for what enterprises, what some of those costs are going to be, it's not always clear and it can be a bit difficult to navigate and to know where you can get trusted information. Grid tariffs and prices. So if we're thinking about that dairy example from before, while they might be generating more energy than they actually need in the dairy, because the supply and demand curves don't match up, they might be selling the energy into the grid for a lower price than what they have to buy it back out of to meet their milking times. Battery systems, this is a key for a lot of the enterprises on ground, though there can be a bit of economic challenges in terms of the cost of batteries and also the lifespans that they're able to run for. The grid maintenance burden, what this is referring to as the current cost of electricity, a lot of that cost is actually going to the upkeep and maintenance of the current grid. And as we get more and more people generating their own energy, like we saw from the NEM stats, it's meaning there's less people buying energy from the grid. So they're essentially needing to pay more of that grid burden. So we get into a bit of a cycle as more people generate their own energy, that cost in the grid goes up. This leads us into policy and regulation. So unless we have policy and regulation changes for a lot of these areas, it's really hard to make some of these decisions on farm. And we can be making decisions based on the current policy and regulation, though it's really hard to know where that's going to be in a couple of years. Contractual agreements, this is referring to a lot of third-party renewable energy. So there's some great example of Farmers for Climate Action members who have taken on energy projects on farm. The barrier here for a lot of landholders is actually getting the legal advice for contracts. So an example of this could be a developer who sets up a project and then may go bust, and that might leave the landholder with the obligation of bringing down any infrastructure and actually paying for the disposal or recycling of that. So there's a big barrier there to actually getting that information for the different type of renewable energy projects you want to undertake. Farmer identity. For a lot of farmers, they're very much reason for what they do is tied up in farming. So if we start to have a lot more renewable energy coming in on farm, and that's drawing a bit of an income, there's a question mark of how does that shift the social and community dynamics for our farming communities. This is tied in with the idea of income mix. So if we start getting a lot more of our income from renewable energy, where if we think about a lot of the climate adaptations that are required, but also climate disasters we've faced, it could be a really big positive to have a consistent income from renewable energy. Though there's a question mark about how this might impact any changes for support from government if the majority of income is coming from renewable energy. License to farm, we're getting more and more conversations with the pressure or the expectation we're putting on landholders to supply clean water, oxygen, sequester carbon, grow food and fibre. And now we're looking at how do we generate renewable energy systems in our landscapes as well. So it's adding another dimension on that idea of what a farmer is needing to produce. Insurance has been an example with solar farms, where if you were to go down the road of agri-politics and you're actually putting a solar array in on your property, and you might run machinery or livestock in close proximity to that array, which is being done, there's a question mark there around how much that's going to increase your cost of insurance on farm. And this ties into the idea of stacking systems as well. I'm sure Caitlyn would have gone over the carbon markets, and that's a really great example where we're now seeing landholders get paid for sequestering carbon on farm and producing food and fibre. There's the same opportunity with renewable energy in terms of producing food and fibre and generating energy on the same piece of land. There's a bit of uncertainty there around how much can we keep stacking these systems. Down the road, would you be able to put a carbon farming agreement on there, or even go into natural capital markets? So renewable energy options, a bit of a simple way I've found to break this down for myself is into 3 categories. So most people are pretty familiar with the different generation options. We've got wind, solar, hydro, biodigesters, and thermal. I struggled to really find any examples of thermal at play in Australia. There are exploratory trials, but it's not really there yet. But if we think about we can generate energy on farm through these different methods, we then either need to use it for our processing or on farm operations. We've got to sell it back into the grid, or we've got to be able to store it. Storage options are things like pumped hydro. A really simple version of this on a lot of farms is any water tank you have up high, you're using energy, mostly in the case of fuel, to push the water up and then allowing gravity to bring that energy back down. Lithium-ion batteries. These are essentially what's in a lot of phones, Teslas, and they're quite often the most common battery used. There's 3 main types of lithium ion. There's lithium phosphate and lithium manganese, and also a cobalt option. Between the 3 of them, there's different costs, but there's also different lifespan efficiencies. So the manganese oxide is often the most expensive, but it's going to last the longest, and you tend to get the greatest efficiency come out of it. One of the newer options coming up is the flow battery. Flow batteries have a bit of an edge over lithium-ion batteries because they're essentially recyclable. They don't have the risk of exploding or any fire, and they're looking like they're going to be as cost-effective as the ion. The other battery option I've put up is the lead-acid battery. This is the kind of battery that's in your car. It's cheaper than both the other types, though it does have challenges with efficiency. So if you drain a lead-acid battery below 50%, you start to have some really big efficiency losses. So if we have these different options of generating energy on farm, and then if we're able to store it, there's still going to be a lot of energy use, as we saw in that data before, in terms of our tractors, farm vehicles, utes, side-by-sides, quads. And unless we actually take that next step to transitioning to either a hydrogen, biofuel, or electrification of these systems, there's a bit of a limitation on how much renewable energy we can use on farm. And at the moment, we can still do a lot with generation and storage. And as this industry of the on-farm continues to develop, that'll open up a lot of opportunities. So just going to run through a few case studies quickly to have a look at some of the examples out there for renewable energy. So this is looking at the Ravenshoe Dairy Farm, which is Atherton Tablelands up in northern Queensland. It's put together by Queensland Farmers Federation, and this photo is from Dairy Australia. QFF essentially did a bit of an energy audit on the farm, and they made 5 recommendations for the dairy system, and the first 4 recommendations were all about increasing efficiencies for the current system. So it wasn't about putting in a big solar array or a wind turbine or anything like that. It was just increasing the efficiency that was currently on farm. With those 4 efficiencies, they were saving about $5,000 per year on average, and they're reducing their emissions of carbon dioxide equivalent by about 15 tonnes per year. Their 5th recommendation was to put in the solar PV system to start generating some of their electricity on farm. So this pushed up their annual savings to a bit over $7,000, and they're sequestering, well, abating 32 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. The cost for all of the changes is about $36K, and they pay this off in under 4 years. So it's a pretty good return on investment in terms of energy savings, but also cost and emissions. This next example is from Hepburn, which is in central Victoria, a couple hours north of Melbourne. And the reason I've picked this case study is because it's an example of a community cooperative in terms of renewable energy. There's some really great examples of wind turbines on agricultural land in Australia, and some of which are Farmers for Climate Action members. But this example is looking at the opportunity that communities have to bring around these renewable energy projects. So this was built in 2011, and it's 2 wind turbines, which are nicknamed Gale and Gusto. They both have a capacity of about 2.05 megawatts, which is 4.1 total. That means they can power about 2,100 homes every year on average. Since construction finished in 2011, they've abated over 100,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide. The total cost was about 15 million, which for a lot of single entity agricultural businesses is pretty daunting. How they raised this was about 9.5 million was raised by the local community. So about 2,000 residents bought in shares to the cooperative to raise this money, and then they received income back from the cooperative. They got about 1.5 million in funding from the local government. The other 3 million they were able to source through a bank loan and then pay that off over time. The really amazing example with Hepburn Wind Farm is that they've actually taken the next step where they're now implementing a solar array and battery system so they can start to even out that energy curve and generate more consistent energy for their communities. The third example we're going to look at is horticulture. So this is the only non-Australian example, and it's a version of agri-voltaics. So this is coming from America and Arizona, and it's part of the Biosphere 2 project. So you can see in this background here, we've got a few solar arrays, and essentially they grew vegetables under these arrays, and then they grew vegetables out here without any impact of the arrays. So the 3 crops they grew were peppers, which is our version of capsicum, jalapenos, and tomatoes. You can see this graph here with the red is the control. So the same vegetable grown without any influence of the panels, and the blue is under panels. So this top graph here is looking at the uptake of carbon dioxide. So for the peppers, they almost added an additional quarter of carbon dioxide equivalent that they're pulling out of the atmosphere into the plant. You can see for the jalapenos, they have a slight drop, and the tomatoes have almost doubled the amount of carbon they're pulling out of the atmosphere by being under panels. This second graph is looking at water use efficiency, which is how much water it takes to grow the yield of that crop. You can see for the peppers, there's a very slight increase. It's pretty negligible, not much of a change. For the jalapenos, they've almost doubled their water use efficiency. So they're using half the water to grow the same amount of produce. Depending where you are and what your cost of water is, that's a potentially huge saving to your total profit margins. For the tomatoes as well, we can almost see a doubling in water use efficiency. So they're almost using half the water to grow the same amount of yield. This bottom graph down here is looking at the total fruit production or yield. For the peppers, they've more than doubled their yield while not really changing any of their water use and taking more carbon out of the atmosphere. Jalapenos have slightly dropped their yield, but have more than doubled their water use efficiency and are taking a little bit less carbon out. So you're getting a little bit of a yield reduction for a huge water use efficiency increase. And tomatoes have over doubled their yield, massively increase their water use efficiency and increase their carbon uptake. So there's other examples of agrivoltaics developing around the world in viticulture systems, berries, there's grazing, which is the most common in Australia, and cropping, like we saw the photo at the start. And the huge opportunity with agrivoltaics is these co-benefits. So the things like water use efficiency, increased carbon uptake, and also increased yield for certain crops. So this is an example down in Tasmania of a local hydro station built on a property by Nigel Tomlin. So Nigel's a 4th generation farmer and he's down in Ellendale in Tasmania. Nigel did spend about 30 years in the hydro industry down in Tasmania. In 2010, there was a few changes in regulation and policy for Tassie, which essentially allowed them to connect to the grid. So Nigel and his son built this project in about 5 months. The really innovative part of this hydro project is you can see the stream running through their property. About 500 metres upstream, they've put in a bit of pipe and they've diverted some of the water down through this little house here into a turbine. The water spins the turbine, which generates electricity, and then the water goes back into the river. This isn't going to be an option on every property, but it does show that where there's water resources and it's within the regulation for that area, there is the opportunity for hydro. It's also not using any damming or big scale engineering. So it's essentially just using that power of the water coming down the hill. They produce about 100 megawatt hours annually, which is enough to power the local town of Ellendale, which is about 38 houses. But this just creates another enterprise for their property. The last example we're going to look at is Berrybank Farms. So Berrybank Farm is in central Victoria near Ballarat, and they're a piggery with about 200,000 pigs at any time. This photo up here is looking at some biodigesters they installed about 30 years ago. How the biodigesters work is that they heat the manure is pumped up into them, they heat it up to about 37 degrees, which is the temperature of the human gut, but also the pig and a lot of livestock guts. That creates the emissions to come out into the digesters, which are able to turn into electricity. Berrybank now generates 90% of their energy needs on farm through the biodigesters. Traditionally, what they would have done was that it would have taken all this manure, mix it with some water, pump it out into some big dams and some slurry ponds. That means you're essentially getting a big smell for those ponds. You're putting all these emissions into the atmosphere and you're centralizing all of these nutrients in a small part of the landscape, which creates a lot of ecological problems. So this is a really innovative solution where they've created 2 more enterprises. They're meeting 90% of their own energy needs. That manure, once it's been through the biodigester, now can be sold as a compost or a fertilizer. So they've opened up another enterprise to be able to sell those goods on. And they also think it's reduced their smell by about 70%, which is a pretty hard thing to quantify, but would make a big difference walking around there every day. So I'm just conscious of time as well. I'll wrap it up here. These steps on the left-hand side come from an Agri-futures report, which I've thrown up on the Moodle as well. And they're just a few steps to give you some ideas about looking at renewable energy on farm. And this first one, which I'd really encourage you to do today, if you haven't already, is book a time in the next couple of weeks with your business partner or your family, whoever you're running the operation with, and just do a bit of a back of the envelope energy audit of your farm. Look at where your main energy uses are, and that's going to give you a bit of understanding for what options are there in the future, but also where you need to go to get that next step of information. I know we've done a bit of a broad brushstroke today and looked at a few different options, but there are a lot of opportunities for renewable energy in Australia with agriculture, and they can form a big adaptation for these systems. And it can be anything from an incremental to a transformational adaptation. At the end of the day, every farm is going to be different. Every business is different, and all of your goals are going to be different. So I think you're in a really amazing community with Farmers for Climate Action. There's people on this call who would have already navigated a lot of this area. So if you have questions or if you'd like to share your stories, I'd really encourage you to put those up on the Moodle. But thanks very much for listening.
Now we have the fifth lecture of the day, which is Professor David Phelps from the TNQ Drought Hub at James Cook University up in Queensland. Dave will be talking about enhancing drought resilience at farm, community and regional scales. So Dave, I will hand over to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks Rachel. Can I just double check that you can see my presentation in Full screen mode?
It looks great, and I can hear you well as well.
Excellent, great, thank you. Well, good day everyone. As Rachel mentioned, I'm the Director of Tropical North Queensland Drought Hub, based with JCU in Townsville. I'll go into a little bit more detail on the Drought Hubs in a moment, but I'll just touch on the Drought Hub work and the Future Drought Fund, because what I wish to mainly share with everyone is my previous 30 years experience living in Longreach, Western Queensland, and how the community really built towards a point of understanding drought resilience, what drought impacts are, not just for farms, but the town and community as well, and some of the practical measures and ways that community pulled together to help during the most recent extended drought. I'd like to open though by acknowledging country and particularly thanking Bernie Singleton Jr. for this wonderful piece of art, which we commissioned as a drought hub, and it represents the saltwater people's understanding of the climate cycle for tropical North Queensland. It's a wonderful piece and a wonderful way, I think, to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. The Tropical North Queensland Drought Hub is one of 8 hubs across Australia. I'll just dwell a little bit on the TNQ hub for starters. The green on the map indicates our geographic footprint, but none of the hubs have a hard and fast geographic boundary. We absolutely work in with all the other hubs nationally. All the hubs are funded through the Future Drought Fund. For ourselves, our core partners are the 6 Northern Queensland Natural Resource Management groups, and we have drought resilience coordinators based in each of those groups, whose role is to be eyes and ears on the ground to create the two-way conversations and flow of information between the region, local issues, ourselves as a drought hub, and then back to the Future Drought Fund as well. For Tropical North Queensland, and I thought I'd include this one because I know there's a lot of Southern Australian participants here as well. So welcome, great to see everyone here from right across Australia, but not everyone realises just how productive agriculture is in Northern Queensland. So it's roughly $7.3 billion of ag contribution towards gross value of production. And it's dominated by livestock, actually, whilst most people might think of mangoes and lychees. For North Queensland, those are definitely important contributors, but served up with a healthy side of steak as well. The priority issues for our particular hub are drought and climate change adaptation, and I think hence today's discussion, land and soil management, innovation and technology, enhancing skills and human capacity, and enhancing sustainable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander resilience. And all of those, we believe, are absolutely crucial towards achieving regional resilience. As I mentioned, there are 8 drought resilience hubs across Australia, funded through the Future Drought Fund. So that's Commonwealth Fund, which has approximately a $100 million per annum investment into building drought resilience. And you'll see that those hubs are spread right across Australia, with each of those hubs associated with a regional university. And that was quite deliberately by design, so that regional universities who are closer in proximity to ag production regions could play a real role in contributing to drought resilience into the future. Just a little bit of coverage on the Future Drought Fund itself. There's 4 key programs at the moment. There will be a new investment phase from June next year for another 4 years. And so whilst programs currently include things like regional drought resilience planning, helping regional communities prepare for drought, etc., those won't necessarily be the themes for the next round of funding. And if any of you had the opportunity to contribute towards what you believe should be themes when there's a public call on in a few weeks' time, I'd certainly encourage you to give some thought around how you think drought resilience can be built within your own regions and how the future drought fund may contribute to that. Okay, so I've used the word drought a number of times, but the definition of drought isn't always clear cut. Matter of fact, if you start reading the literature right around the world, and there's hundreds of books and tens of thousands of research publications, certainly relating to drought, you actually struggle to find consensus as to what the term really is. For Australia, the Bureau of Meteorology simply defined it as a prolonged abnormally dry period when the amount of available water is insufficient to meet normal use. So, roughly speaking, I reckon what the BOM are trying to say is there's not enough rain to fill dams, to grow crops, or to grow pasture to feed livestock. Essentially what it boils down to. Specifically for Queensland, it's generally accepted as the lowest 10% of rainfall years. And of course, drought starts with a lack of rain, but that can lead to hydrological drought. So that may be a lack of water in farm dams. It may be a lack of stream flows. It might have ecological impacts through a lack of stream flows, for instance, or it could lead to industrial drought. And if you read the information from Europe, they often talk about industrial drought, which is where some of the major rivers, for instance, the flow in those rivers may be reduced by as little as 5 to 10% because of dry conditions in the catchment. But that means that the factories actually lose productivity, either because they don't have access to the water required for their industrial processes, or because they have to limit their discharge rates into those rivers. And of course, which most of you will be more familiar with, agricultural drought. But there's also socioeconomic drought. So within the last 4 or 5 years, we've coined a couple of new terms. One is a cash drought and one is a population drought. And they both relate to the socioeconomics, particularly of towns and communities. So if you think about it, when the rain stops and drought really starts to bite, quite obviously the first people impacted are the landholders themselves. But normally that means that there's a lack of income, a lack of funds to spend in town, whether that be a slowdown in, say, purchase of fencing materials or maybe irrigation supplies, etc. And it starts to build within the town and community as well. When there's, I guess, enough of a lack of income for the town and community, unfortunately, that often leads to jobs, job losses. People then need to start leaving town to search for work elsewhere. And you also get this spiral downwards in terms of the population. And that can have all sorts of impacts on community groups, sporting clubs, and others, because whilst volunteer rates within rural and regional Australia are generally quite high as 18 or 20%. If a little town like, say, Longreach goes from 3,000 people to 2,500 people because of lack of jobs due to the drought, then you've also got less people overall actually able to be, say, the president of the pony club or treasurer for life. I'll just touch on for a moment what drought might look like within a couple of regions across Northern Australia into the future. This is all available through the CSIRO climate change dashboard. If you haven't had a look there, it's a great tool. And specifically for Queensland, there's another great tool, which is the Queensland Climate Dashboard hosted on the Long Paddock website. For the Northern Rangelands, so for the interior of Australia, the time spent in drought is projected to increase, and there's a medium level of confidence around that. Sort of perversely, I guess, though, changes to rainfall are actually unclear. So I think it's important that we're all aware of how robust different predictions can be as well for the future. Because to me, what that says is that whilst we've got a medium confidence around drought increasing in frequency and or intensity, it's still actually unclear whether that will be because lower rainfall overall, or it may be longer gaps between falls of rain, or it could be later starts to the season. Those types of things, unfortunately, are still rather unclear, and that makes the future, of course, that much more uncertain. There's pretty high confidence, however, that extreme rainfall events will increase. So unfortunately, events like we've witnessed, say, in the Western Gulf part of Queensland, where there was major flooding earlier in the year, those types of events are quite likely to increase. Across monsoonal Northern Australia, for there, even the changes in drought frequency, duration or intensity are quite unclear at this stage. So that's coupled in as well with the uncertainty around the changes to rainfall. But again, there's a high confidence in the increased intensity of extreme rainfall events. For both areas, and also for Southern Australia, there's generally quite high confidence that temperatures will continue to increase, bursts of hot weather, heat waves, etc., will continue to increase. So if you're in an agricultural area that relies on horticulture, that relies on temperature regulation for flowering and those sorts of things, then unfortunately the impacts there could be quite damaging into the future. And whilst heat waves and the like may not be drought as such, could still have the same impacts in terms of reduced productivity on farm, hence reducing cash flow into towns and ultimately leading to population loss. So I mentioned at the start that I've lived in Longreach for the previous 30 years. Of that time, I reckon I could only say there's been about 5, maybe 6 really good years. We had a run from 2009 to 2012 that was quite a run of good seasons. 2000 was a big year, and there were some reasonably good seasons from about 92 through to about 96 as well. The rest of the time has been some degree of drought. And a lot of the interior of Australia certainly is exposed to extended droughts. For central Western Queensland in particular, the most recent one began in around 2012, 2013, just depending on where you were. And drought declarations have generally only just been lifted now. So that's 8 to 9 years, depending on where you were. And the longer the drought drags on, of course, the greater the impacts in terms of reduced cash flow, impacts on towns, etc. Can even get to the point where extended droughts undermine industry confidence and reduce personal well-being. So just as an example, this particular data is from an AgForce survey in 2015. They determined that a nudge over half of landholders had less than half the usual stock numbers. So it's about 3 years into the drought. And that 82% of landholders were reporting, even at that stage, severely reduced income. Then through a group that we formed in Western Queensland called the Western Queensland Drought Appeal, we conducted further surveys to look at what was the impact on the town-based businesses across central Western Queensland. We split into tourism, town-based agribusiness, retail and services. And across all of those different groupings, there was anywhere between a 50 and 80% reduction in business turnover, in their, not just their income, but their overall cash turnover. Everyone reported reduced staff numbers or hours worked. I know in some cases, business owners were even digging into their own super funds so that they could keep staff on at least in a part-time capacity. And one of the reasons that they were doing that is that particularly the younger staff were probably sons or daughters of friends of theirs, of other valued community members, and they were doing their best to try and keep people in the town and engaged in work in the community. And that's why 40% of shop owners had actually stopped paying themselves. And then 1 in 4 people, as shown by this graph, actually left central Western Queensland. So that's pretty tough. I mean, that's 1 in 4 of your mates heading off because they can't find any work or adequate work, moving to different regions to try and find work. Now, of course, the decline in rural populations isn't new, and there's that whole backdrop, I guess, if you like, of things like technology improvements, people drifting towards larger cities and urban areas, but this was certainly exacerbated by the drought period, because you can see during 2009 through to about 2011, there was a bit of an uptick in terms of the population. And that was during the run of better seasons, when there was greater prosperity, basically. So I mentioned this is against the backdrop of overarching socioeconomic change. The consolidation of small towns in general does mean that communities are disappearing, and I reckon each one of you on this call could pinpoint a small town that's in decline or perhaps has disappeared entirely within your own region. And part of that also relates to increased output with less workers. And within agriculture, that's one of the focal points for our whole industry, is actually becoming more efficient, more labour efficiency, more productivity efficiency, greater water use efficiency. That's all ingrained into how we need to operate within agriculture to be globally competitive. But I guess I'd just like to put out the challenge for people to think, how can we retain workers in our communities? What is there in, say, ag tech, consulting opportunities and other opportunities to actually keep people in our small towns? I'm convinced that ag technology, for instance, doesn't have to be all focused in Brisbane or Sydney or Melbourne or Perth, that there's absolutely opportunities for regional Australia to tap into development. And I'll give one example. There's a company by the name of OPS Australia, which is based out of Longreach. They have treated ag tech a bit differently. They have an advisory board of landholders that review their products every 6 months and look for opportunities to actually build new technologies or link with other technology companies to the greatest benefit of not just the farm, but also the town. So they've actually employed, from about 5 years ago with one person, they've now got about 8 to 10 staff. Most of those staff are employed within Longreach, and they actually build their ag tech there in Longreach. So just one example of how it can actually happen in regional Australia. But drought is certainly a major disruptor. Other disruptors include market access, export prices. Goats, for instance, are probably a good example of that. 98% of Australia's goats are exported, most of those to America. And there's been a crash in goat meat prices from about $10 a kilo only 18 months ago to around $4 a kilo now. So that's an external disruptor that's not drought related, but another example of a major disruptor. And particularly throughout inland Australia, the rangelands and the pastoral zones, agriculture is very much linked to rain-fed agriculture, and hence those entire regions are susceptible to drought. The Productivity Commission reported back in 2017 that most of, certainly Northern Australia, was poorly adapted in general, poorly adapted to shocks. There's some exceptions. The lighter blue areas, for instance, around Darwin, certainly an exception. A fair bit of, I guess, the coastal central WA, for instance, is an exception. But I think it gives us pause to consider as well as to how we might build that adaptive capacity. So that leads me to resilience. I said before that drought's poorly defined. Well, resilience is even more poorly defined. When you read books and articles on resilience, there's all sorts of ways of viewing it. But I prefer to look at it in a simple term of becoming stronger, better, and readier. for the future. Learning from where you've been, I guess taking those lessons through adversity and applying them to a new reality. What's absolutely important though is that communities' goals and ambitions are included in any discussion around resilience. So the worst thing that any of us could do is to come in and try and impose some preconceived idea of resilience on an area where it really may not work at all. Resilience is needed at individual property and farm and agribusiness levels, such as maximising the health of our natural resource base or optimising production efficiency, but also the town and community and regional levels. All of those, of course, are totally intertwined and interrelated. At the individual property business, things like building financial, natural resource and people reserves during the good times to provide that buffer for when the drought does return is essential. Ensuring that production systems, soils, etc., are all healthy and performing as best as they possibly can. But something that we often overlook is that it's fundamentally important that the people on the land are able to, that they're able to make effective decisions, that there's support mechanisms for their well-being so that when they are under stress, when you are cutting water and feed for 16 hours a day, for instance, during drought, or you're doing a range of activities to try and get a crop in place, etc., that you can still make effective decisions. Because unfortunately, in general, people under the pump start to make ineffective decisions. At the town and country level, it's essential to have proactive communities who can lead the response. There's all sorts of, again, books and research material out there written about how successful communities also have great leaders. Now, a great leader doesn't necessarily mean that it's someone who rallies the troops and, you know, gets 10,000 followers behind them or on Facebook or whatever. It may be leading from behind as well. It might be those quiet achievers chipping away in the background that help create the glue to hold communities together. But I will touch on media. It's also really important to engage with the media. We certainly learnt this in Longreach and Central Western Queensland during the most recent drought, is that you can actually start to influence the narrative yourself. To be perfectly frank, we were pretty sick of the media treating us all as victims, of portraying farmers and townspeople within the drought as being perhaps both hopeless and hapless, which we weren't. I mean, we knew that we were strong and that we would get through this. And we started to have discussions, I guess, with the right people in the media, whether that be the morning show, whether that be the ABC TV or radio. And we were certainly benefited by having an ABC radio station headquartered in Longreach as well. And those people were directly experiencing it for themselves. And I think it's really important to try and tap in as best as possible to people who have that shared experience, who can promote the cause and say that, look, times are tough, but the people are resilient and they'll pull through and they're learning from this. They're not just hopeless victims. And then when we come to regional resilience, quite obviously, on-farm resilience, town and community resilience all benefits the regional resilience that rolls up to that regional level, but there's also some aspects that are a bit different. There's greater opportunities to diversify the economic base for a region than there may be within an individual business. And there's also potential to decouple the economic base, or at least components of the economic base, from rain-fed agriculture. So tourism as just one example. And capturing place-based advantages, one thing that we still can't replicate through online, through 3D adventures or whatever, is actually the experience of being in a place. And everywhere has some sort of place-based advantage that you can capture to really help build the regional resilience. As I mentioned, proactive communities, absolutely essential. essential to do things like leading the response, maintaining and building social cohesion. I'm a member of the Rotary Club of Longreach, and one of the really simple things that we did was have pop-up movie nights under the stars, out in paddocks. All the neighbours would come in, and we'd also bring the Royal Flying Doctor Service community worker or psychiatrist with us, not to give presentations, but just to mingle, have a chat. They're a professional who can really keep their finger on the pulse and identify if localities or individuals, for that matter, seeming to be starting to struggle. So mainly, I'd like to leave all of you with the thought that we can all contribute to resilience. We can all work within our own localities and regions to help build knowledge, either as a local community with external partners, with government agencies and others. We can identify our shared goals and values, and we can certainly all contribute to resilience through connections to place, through building strong networks, collaborative governance, and sustained financial investment. So thank you very much. Rachel, thank you for that. And
we're going to move now on to Dr Bec Colvin. Bec has been through so much in the last few hours to be here with you all today, and it involves a broken down bus on the side of the federal highway traveling from Canberra to Sydney, but I'll let her tell you that fun story. Bec is a social scientist and a senior lecturer at the ANU Crawford School of Public Policy, and she mainly researches the social and political dimensions of climate change, climate policy, and energy transition. So it's so great to have you with us here today, Bec. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It is a pleasure to be here, not just because this is a wonderful session to be part of, but as you said, it looks like I might not have been able to get here earlier on. So thanks, everybody, for having me in. I'm afraid that I missed most of David's talk. Thanks, David, as well, for your understanding today when I was on the side of the highway. But it sounded like a really fascinating conversation, and especially those closing themes about really building connections and community. I can see that that flows into a bit of what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So I'll be speaking to you about communicating about climate change, and really the big picture of communication that sits in my research, my teaching in this space, is all about relationships. So really understanding how it is that we communicate about complex and often contentious topics in a way that can bring us together or sometimes drive us apart. So I'll be talking largely about these themes with you today, giving you a little bit of theory that I find very useful for understanding these topics, and then also talking about some strategies for communication. So one of the first things is that when we're thinking about who we are, like you're here in this Climate Essentials workshop, you're no longer an everyday person who's engaging with climate change just in the way that everyday people do. It sounds to me like if you're here, you're probably someone that we think of as a climate change communicator. That personal life, something that you choose to take on with your friends and your family, or it could be in your professional world as well. That's part of what you get paid to do. Maybe it's at the intersection of both. So when you become a communicator for climate change, we have a very different way of thinking about climate change than the everyday people get. So for everyday people, thinking about the complexity of climate change is kind of like looking at a sculpture where you stick your feet on the ground, you have your own position, your own perspective, and you look at it from that position and perspective, and you see it in the way that you want to see it. You might see that there's someone off 90 degrees away from you looking at things from their perspective, and they probably see the sculpture totally differently. And that's fine. You don't have to worry about what it looks like to them. You just see it from your own perspective. But for those of us that are doing some degree of communication, we don't get the comfort of seeing this complex issue just from our own perspectives. We have to make that shift from looking at a sculpture to something that we can draw as this analogy from the art world of looking at a cubist work of art. So based on what I understand, the cubists in their two-dimensional painting style took a three-dimensional object and they imagined what would it look like if you peeled it apart and then stuck it on that two-dimensional canvas, so that you see all of the different perspectives at once. You lose the comfort of seeing things in the way that's familiar and that speaks to what makes sense to you. And instead you have that discordance of seeing lots of different trade-offs and complexities, all of the multiple perspectives there at once. You can see where there's points of conflict and maybe points of unforeseen complementarity. So for those of us doing the communication, that's the way that we have to see climate change. We have to be able to see that there's so much going on at once, and then through careful and informed communication, navigate all of that complexity. And so to give you an example, some research that I did, this is from a few years ago now, I had the good fortune of going to King Island. Many of you will know King Island is an island halfway between Tassie and the rest of Australia, sort of at the border of the Bass Strait and the Southern Ocean. I was interested in what were the community experiences of a really large scale wind energy development in King Island. And the research was super interesting on that topic. I learned a lot from the people in King Island who helped me to understand more about that complexity. But something that came up, and really it was a fairly minor point in the scheme of the research, but it has stuck with me when thinking about communication. And it was that I went into this research thinking, I'm going to King Island to learn about a wind farm. That to me was an apolitical, there were no values in it. It was simply a statement of fact. It was a way that I could communicate information to anybody else, to tell them what I was doing research on. But when I was in King Island, some people who I became quite close to and have stayed in touch with since I was there, pointed out to me that they actually didn't like the term wind farm. And that's because from their perspective, they saw turbines as being an imposition into an agrarian landscape. They felt that the term wind farm was a way of trying to trick people into thinking that turbines belong in King Island. They belong alongside the cows and the fields and the rolling green hills. And to them, instead, what should be described, or how the project should be described, was as a wind factory. Because from their perspective, from their values, from the way that they valued the environment and the landscape there in King Island, they saw this wind energy development as basically presenting a major industrialization of the landscape. And so what that really shows is that this term that at the time to me was an innocent term describing the nature of the project that I was doing my research on, wind farm, actually had so much more packaged up into it. It wasn't just the information that I was communicating, but it was signaling a whole lot of things about who I am, whether I see wind turbines as belonging in the landscape or being maybe problematic in the landscape. And importantly, it signaled to people, was I one of us or was I one of them? Was I using the language that said I have shared views, shared values, shared identity to one group, or was I signaling an alliance to another group? And this happens a lot with issues to do with climate change. Like that term in itself, climate change, it has such heft to it. I'm sure many of you can reflect on experiences where the term itself has been something that you've wanted to think about. Do I use the term climate change right now, or is it not the right time to do it? But there's a whole lot of other terms and a whole lot of other concepts that have similar connotations and ways that they're interwoven with the social world. And a way that we can think about that with climate change in particular and all of the associated aspects of climate change is that it's not really an issue of science anymore, or at least not in the minds of the majority of people. You've heard from people like Mark Howden, and I assure you it is an issue of science for Mark, as well as Mark being this extraordinary wealth of knowledge across all the social and political and policy and economic dimensions as well. But for people who see climate change as an issue of science, they're the folks that are going and reading the IPCC reports, looking at the peer-reviewed science, really thinking about the weight of evidence in favor of some hypotheses and not others. But for most people, climate change is a social object. They hear about climate change in passing in the media. They hear their mates talking about it. It might be that conversation that you have at the pub on a Friday afternoon with your friends in your extended social circle. Or it could be what you overhear in the cafe. When it's a social object, we're not really informing our opinion based on that weighing up of evidence, but seeing what is it that people around us think? What is it that people like us think? And how does that inform what it makes sense for us to think and to express about something like climate change? So to give you more of an example, and this is really to bring in the I guess we could say, uncomfortable or awkward fact that not only is climate change a social object, but really it's a social political object. I can give you the example of Bob Inglis, who was a congressperson for the Republican Party in the US, and he was in Congress around the time that Al Gore from the Democrats was running for president. And Bob Inglis is really interesting because you can see the quote from him on the screen. And he says that he didn't know anything about climate change until he heard Al Gore, his political opponent, saying, this is an issue that we need to do something about. So that signaled to Bob that this is for those people, not for people like us to care about. So he took the position of therefore opposing action on climate change. Now, if that's where the story ended, you might not think it's a particularly remarkable story. In fact, you might know of some other people that have followed a similar path, mind you, not necessarily in national US politics. But Bob's story continues, and that's what makes it really interesting, is that later on, Bob's son said to him, you know, if you don't clean up your act on the environment and on climate change, you're not going to have my vote. And instead of Inglis crossing his arms and saying, oh, the youth of today and blah, 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 show some respect for your parents, he actually reflected upon his position. And he went on what was effectively a journey of rediscovering the evidence basis for climate change. He went to Antarctica, he went to the Arctic, he connected directly with the scientists studying the ice cores, generating the knowledge bases that underpin so much of what we understand about climate change. And to his immense credit, he updated his position. He has since become an advocate or an agitator within the Republican Party and within the conservative movement in the US more generally for a forward-looking approach on climate change. Now, his story also doesn't completely end there. That's the big picture of what I want to be telling you about, but there is a little bit more to the story, which is, of course, when Inglis updated his position on climate change, and as you can see in the quote, he was from a conservative district in a conservative state in the US, some of the big fossil fuel donors ended up throwing their resources behind a different candidate who did have a much more favourable position on climate change compared to Inglis's updated position. And that's largely why he's now a former congressman, not a present congressman in the US. But that's a bigger part of the story and perhaps for a slightly different topic. But that's the US context. So that's where you can see that these political cues informed whether people see climate change as being something for them or something that's not for them and maybe for their political opponents or a social group that's different from them. In Australia, we see similar patterns, but not the same magnitude in terms of polarisation. In Australia, we've had people replicate studies from the US about polarisation on climate change, and they've had to go much further to the political polls to get the same degree of polarisation that you see in the US. So in the US, between the two major parties of Democrats and Republicans, in Australia, you've got to go to the Greens and One Nation to get the same amount of polarisation on climate change. So good for us. We're only the second most polarised country in terms of left-right divide on climate change after the US, not the first. But over the last few years, in particular since about 2018, things have been shifting and that political gap has been closing. And what we're finding is that we're still seeing that there are political differences in Australia in terms of people's attitudes toward climate change. But it's by no means a hard line of, yes, it's real, yes, we want action, or no, it's not real and we don't want any action. It's much more about degrees of support or urgency or importance or relative importance of climate change in relation to other things. So you can see some data on the screen. This is actually a little snippet from an article on The Conversation that Frank Yotzo and I wrote a couple of years ago. It was based on some research we did looking at people's attitudes toward climate change in the context of the 2019 federal election. And so what I want to show to you is that we can see that overall there's 4/5 of people saying that action on climate change is important. That's a big, compelling majority. And you do see that difference between what we've called the progressive voters and the conservative voters. But it's in that, there's a difference from 92% to 70% there, but they're still convincing majorities anyway. So all of this is to say that although we have these political aspects that shape the way climate change plays out in Australian society, it's by no means a completely lost cause in terms of political polarisation, in the aggregate level anyway. Another Australian example, and this is moving me a little bit closer toward talking to you about the theory that I promised I would. And this was a study from quite a few years ago now. I can't actually see the date on the screen, but so it was published in 2018. I think the data were collected in 2015 or 2016, perhaps. And this was a question that was put to people. And the question was something like, would you support an emissions trading scheme in order to deal with climate change? And the numbers that you can see on the left of the graph, starting with 97% at the top, it's covered on my screen, but I think I remember that's what the number is. Then 90%, 74% and 49% is showing you the percent of people who identified as voters for different parties who said, yes, we would support an emissions trading scheme. So predictably, you can see very high levels of support among Greens and Labor voters, and then a much more tentative level of support amongst coalition voters at 49%, so just shy of half. And we can predict that because we have this thing called political anchoring, which is where once a topic has become associated with one side or another of politics, then the way that we appraise future policy proposals or continued policy proposals from the past associated with that issue gets overly coloured by our political preference. We use the position of what we expect should be aligned with our political party in order to inform the position that we ourselves take. And so the fact that we had a really divisive and very much partisan debate on climate change in the years leading up to when this research was done should make us expect that we would have quite a large difference between voters for Labor and the Greens versus voters for the coalition parties. That's not the interesting bit. The interesting bits are numbers on the other side of the screen, where you can see 88, 80, 72 and 58%. So what was asked here was the same question: would you support an emissions trading scheme? But there was one extra sentence added in. And that extra sentence said something like, both Labor Party leader Bill Shorten and Liberal Party Minister Malcolm Turnbull favour this approach. So look at the difference in the numbers, the percent of support among voters for different political parties that you get just with the addition of that one sentence to the question that they were asked. You see a 9 percentage point increase among coalition voters in their support for an emissions trading scheme. That goes from being just below half to being probably outside of the margin of error, saying more than half would support an emissions trading scheme. That's described by what's called the leadership queue effect. So when there's this political anchoring where people who are voters for the coalition parties might think it's normal for our parties to not support this type of proposal or policy, being cued that a leader from their side of politics would support the policy helps to enable at least some of those people to go, you know what, maybe I can support this too. But there's a different type of queue also happening. And this is what you see in the change amongst support from the Labor and the Greens voters. A change of just about the same magnitude, like 9 or 10 percentage point decrease in support for an emissions trading scheme. So there's still a queuing effect here from leadership, but there's something different going on, which is probably due to this thing that we call positive differentiation. But once you have people who see themselves as being part of a group, like their political group or their political affiliation, and they gain some sort of value like self-esteem from being different to those people who are outsiders, who are from a different group, then they're motivated to maintain that point of difference. So for a subset of Greens and Labor voters, hearing that there would be support from the other side of politics for the thing that they should be supporting led to a decrease in support from some people as well. So this shows this very relational, this complex and constantly changing dynamic political context in which we explore different policy options and think about who gets to say that climate change is something for them or for other people, who gets to own policy solutions. And there is a theory that helps us to understand why this plays out in the way that it does. And that's called the social identity approach. This is the theory that I've used in most of my own research. And the reason that I use it is because I find it very useful. It has a great ability to be able to give a way for thinking about the social relations that are at play in complex issues like climate change, energy transition, how we deal with environmental crises. And the social identity approach is known as a meta-theoretical framework. It actually draws together two distinct theories, both from social psychology, that explain different parts of what's going on in the world. And when you put them together, you get a really nice explanation about what's happening. So the first of those is called self-categorization theory. That's a person choosing which mask to put on. And self-categorization theory is all about the way in which we come to identify with social groups. So we'll see a group that has some sort of identity. Maybe it's academics, maybe it's people who sat on the highway on a broken down bus, maybe it's dog walkers, maybe it's football fans, maybe it's voters for the Labor Party or the Greens or the Coalition, whatever it is, as long as it has some sort of psychological value that says this word describes a group that I'm part of, it's a social identity category. And so once you have one of those social identity categories, that becomes an in-group. And self-categorization theory explains how it is that people come to identify with in-groups, and then how their understanding of what that in-group is and what it means to be part of that in-group comes to be part of the way they understand themselves. The other part of the social identity approach is social identity theory. And social identity theory is all about what happens once we have this groupish context. When people are moving through the world in a way that is shaped by the groups to which they belong, we end up with dynamics, not just within in-groups, but between in-groups and out-groups as well. And so when we end up in a setting where there's an in-group and there's an out-group and they have differences on some sort of issue, so they're in a state of some sort of groupish conflict, you see a whole lot of predictable dynamics play out. We'll see people showing favoritism toward their in-group. They'll look at distributing resources in a way that disproportionately benefits the in-group in comparison to out-groups. They'll trust information that comes from in-groups and be suspicious of information that comes from out-groups. They'll be hostile towards out-groups. And if someone from an in-group does something that might be a little bit dubious in terms of its intent or the nature of the action, we'll tend to interpret it in a fairly favorable or charitable way. Whereas if someone from the out-group does the same thing, we'll see it in the worst possible light. We also find that norms, so norms are kind of like rules, sometimes explicit rules and sometimes implicit rules about how we dress, how we act, what we say, what we eat, how we talk to other people, the opinions that we express on complex issues. These norms spread really, really easily within in-groups. Having a shared sense of identity is kind of like having a really well-maintained highway that connects a couple of people within an in-group to get that norm to spread. But then norms, although they spread really well within in-groups, they come up with a lot of resistance going from an in-group to an out-group, because that identity difference acts as a barrier to the uptake of that norm by an out-group. We also find that leadership of identity groups behaves differently in settings of conflict to settings of harmony. So when you're in a setting without conflict and you've got a group, and let's say you align your group along some sort of relevant spectrum, like extremeness of opinion on something, you'd expect that the group leader would adopt a fairly moderate position, and they do. They become kind of like the average of everyone in the group. But when you end up in a setting of conflict, that changes, because instead of the leader representing that moderate position for the group, they end up going extreme so that they're polarized with the out-group, because they get more power, more value by showing how different they are to the out-group rather than saying how much they are kind of like the average of their own in-group. So all of these types of dynamics play out over and over again, and you can think of it as being kind of like the science of us and them. Some of the research that I've done a couple of years ago was taking this approach and applying it as a lens to think about how was it that this protest movement ahead of the 2019 federal election, some of you might have been aware of at the time and might still recall, called the Stop Adani Convoy, how this played out in regional resource towns. And so this was not looking so much at the convoy itself. I wasn't there, so I don't know what it was like. I wasn't in any of the towns that it visited, but looking at the media coverage. So recognizing that the media becomes an important place where narratives are shared and people look to the media to seek their understandings of the world that they're not experiencing directly. This particular protest movement did a fantastic job at widening divides between groups about energy transition and climate change. It created these, or maybe not created, but it took actions that made certain markers of belonging to an us or a them become really prominent in the media coverage. So this was all of the people bound together in the convoy having shared action, shared iconography, going to the same place, calling for the same thing. And then you had the counter movement emerge with a whole lot of support from the Queensland Resources Council that really pushed forward that counter movement up in Queensland, but had the same sort of thing in answer to the convoy, which was their own iconography, their own claims, their own asks, their own way of coming together and behaving. And so these markers of belonging differed along 3 key dimensions. We ended up seeing that in the narratives in the media, if you are from Queensland, you're with the counter movement. If you're from anywhere else, you're probably with the convoy participants. If you're from the cities, you're with the convoy. But if you're from the regions, you're with the counter movement. If you're a hard worker, you're with the counter movement. But if you're on either side of the Goldilocks zone of being a hard worker, if you're a dole bludger or an elite, you're with the convoy participants as well. And so this wasn't great for having a kind of responsible, constructive, forward-looking and inclusive national conversation on how to deal with energy transition in Australia. And that maybe could have been better. But it doesn't end there. These sorts of issues, the way that social identity plays out over time, has a lasting impact. And that's because those markers of belonging, which side are you on of the us and the them divide, stay with us and become tools for us to make sense of future issues that emerge, where we look to our past experience and say, what makes sense for a person like me on this issue? So the social identity approach and a whole lot of kind of adjacent work from social psychology and political science helps us see that there are a whole lot of challenges in communicating on complex issues like climate change. But we can look to that same body of knowledge to get some insights about how can we start to communicate like a cubist? How can we start to navigate those complexities when we see the world and all of its different complexities and different dimensions all at once? How do we start to move through that? I've got 4 recommendations for you and I'll move through them one at a time. So the first is to keep out of the trenches when you can. And part of what you can do here is avoiding scripted sound bites. If you hear a 3-word slogan that seems to be kind of increasing the blood pressure when people hear it from the mouth of a politician on the media or whatever, maybe avoid that. Find another way to talk about the same issue that doesn't use that sound bite. Because I think of it, when we follow the scripts, it's kind of like taking the first step in a dance where your partner knows exactly what step they should take when they see you take that step. So rehearsing and repeating those sound bites is a great way to make sure that we stay in the trenches and we stay locked in our old positions. And also think about shifting from an interaction mode of debate, which is where you try to overcome the person that you're speaking to show them that they're wrong and they should be ashamed of themselves, to an approach informed by deliberation. And you can think about that as going from standing head to head, which is the debate model, trying to defeat someone, to shifting around so that you're shoulder to shoulder. So it's kind of like you're exploring the complexity of the issue together. You can also think about the power of talking within the in-group. And so this might be sometimes thinking about who is actually the best messenger to be connecting with a particular target group. If you're taking a very strategic approach to communication, that might involve thinking about how do you form relationships with effective messengers toward a target group rather than yourself or someone else as part of who you're working with going in and having that conversation. But on the other hand, it's also thinking about what are your in-groups that you have the ability to work with that pre-existing trust and knowledge, and the fact that people will see you based on knowing you, not just see you as an outsider and find it easy to dismiss what you're saying. I think, David, you might have been talking about being involved in your Rotary Club. Like, this is a perfect example of the sort of thing that makes sense for where you can talk within an in-group. You can also think about in any particular interaction, focus on building the relationship with someone else rather than persuading them in that one instant that they're wrong and you're right. You're not going to do it most of the time anyway. Whereas if you focus on the relationship, you build that trust and that ability to come back together and have a constructive conversation in the future. The second recommendation is to think about how you can find what resonates. So this is about understanding people's values and identity and talking to them in a way that what you're saying resonates with who they are and what they already know about the world. Resonating is where it's kind of like if we're this complex, multi-dimensional puzzle piece, you find the things that stick, not the things that are going to bounce off because they're so at odds with what we value and who we are. And so when you talk to people, think about ways that you can promote that they can merge lanes on a highway rather than giving them kind of like an ultimatum or something so confronting that it feels like if they were to accept what you're saying, they have no choice but to do a full U-turn, to flip their life upside down in that one moment. People do that sometimes, but not often. You can also think about the way that you frame what you're talking about. So framing is where you've got a big complex issue, and it's kind of like you take a picture frame and put it over part of the issue, and you draw attention to that part of the issue. You can frame messages in a way that might take something like climate change, and instead of saying this is a great environmental challenge, isn't this terrible for the polar bears? You can frame it in a different way that could be about how this is going to affect human health or affect our communities or affect our futures. Using frames that match with people's values and identity is a really good way to connect with people. We can also use the power of analogies, and this is especially when we want to take something unfamiliar and make it familiar. The third recommendation is to take people with you. So this is to tell stories rather than barrage people with fact after fact. And as much as you can, share journeys instead of judgments. And this can be your own journey, which relates to the I, not you statements. So when you can talk about your own journey, especially a journey of change and reflection, you're making sure that you're not putting someone on the spot, making them potentially defensive. But it also means that you're saying, you know, it's okay to change. It's okay to grow. It's okay to say something today that's different from something you said at the pub really loudly in front of a big group of people a couple of months ago. And the fourth recommendation is to match words with actions. So we know that people who are communicators are most effective communicators when they've done a bit themselves, or they've done their bit in their own personal life. We also have to think about the in-group, out-group dynamic. So if you change your practices or change your actions so much that you become really at odds with everyone else, you've gone too far, you potentially lose your power as an in-group messenger. You become an outsider, a weirdo that people are going to go, well, maybe that makes sense for them in their hair shirt, but not for anybody else. So if you want to think in strategic terms about communication, maybe think about how your actions can help you to skirt those boundaries without crossing them. On the other hand, if you just want to live your life in a way that means you're doing what pleases you, don't worry about any of that. Horses for courses, what makes sense for different people. But of course, we also know that behavior change and practice change or practice innovation spreads the most. And we've got heaps of evidence to show this. Not when people are told that they should do it, but when they can see people around them doing the thing. Because people around them doing the thing, it becomes a cue that makes sense for people like me to do the thing as well. You kind of get the proof, and we call this social proof, that it makes sense to update your practices or to express new opinions when you see other people around you. And then finally, if you're talking to someone about a pretty complex and weighty issue like climate change, try not to leave them in a state of despair. You know, we hear this from school kids all the time. A PhD scholar, Rachel and I both know Tanya Russell. She heard this loud and clear doing research with young people. They get left with the despair and they don't know what to do with it. So as much as you can, if you're talking to someone about climate change, be a compass. Don't tell them what they should do as if you know best, but guide them toward where they can empower themselves to get information, to make decisions for themselves. So those are the 4 recommendations informed by lots of social psychology and political science research and communications research, and how you can communicate with like a cubist to navigate the complexity of climate change. So I'll wrap up there. Thanks very much for your attention. And thanks, Rachel and David, for making space for me today.